Blood soaked through Clara Whitmore's sleeve as she dragged 200 pounds of dying rancher across frozen ground, while rifle fire cracked overhead. 3 bullets had already kissed the dirt beside her boots. She could have run, should have run, but the stubborn bastard bleeding out in her arms was the only man in Colorado who'd looked at her worn face and calloused hands without flinching. Now some land barons' hired guns wanted him dead, and Clara Whitmore hadn't crossed half a continent just to watch another good thing die in the dirt. If you want to see how a widow nobody wanted became the woman who brought the most feared man in the territory to his knees, stay until the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far Clara's story reaches. The train lurched to a grinding halt at the excuse for a station they called Cedar Bend, spitting out black smoke and a shower of sparks that died in the October wind. Clara Whitmore gripped the iron railing as her boots hit the platform, and every eye in that dusty Colorado settlement turned to stare. Not the curious kind of staring, the other kind. The kind that measured and found wanting before you'd even opened your mouth. She'd known this moment was coming since Pittsburgh. Known it through every mile of track, every jerking stop, every night sleeping upright in a coach seat with her carpetbag clutched against her ribs like armor. Mail-order brides were supposed to be young, supposed to be fresh-faced and hopeful, all dewy skin and nervous giggles. Clara was 37 years old, tall as most men, with hands that had buried a husband and worked a failed farm until the bank came calling. The dusty blue dress she wore had been mended so many times the original fabric was more memory than cloth. She saw him immediately. The rancher, Silas Mercer, had to be. He stood apart from the small cluster of townsfolk, shoulders squared like he was bracing for bad weather. Tall, sun-beaten, somewhere in his 40s with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had forgotten how to smile years ago. His eyes swept over her once, then again, slower. And there it was. That flicker. That split second of pure disappointment that men never learn to hide. Clara had seen that look before. Hell, she'd been seeing it since she was 16 and shot up past every boy in her county. But this time it landed different. This time she'd spent her last $12 on a train ticket based on 3 letters and a photograph that was probably 10 years old. This time she had exactly nowhere else to go. The silence stretched. A woman in a green dress whispered something behind a gloved hand. 2 ranch hands by the water trough stopped mid-conversation. Even the station master paused in the doorway, watching like this was better entertainment than anything Cedar Bend had seen in months. Then Silas Mercer did something Clara hadn't expected. He took off his hat, held it against his chest, and walked forward with his hand extended. "Mrs. Whitmore." His voice was rough, unused to softness. "Welcome to Cedar Bend." Clara took his hand. His grip was solid, careful, the handshake of a man who knew his own strength and didn't need to prove it. "Mr. Mercer." "Your bag?" He nodded toward the carpetbag at her feet. "I can carry it." "Didn't say you couldn't." He picked it up anyway, then gestured toward a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. "It's about an hour to the ranch. Road's decent if the weather holds." The crowd was still watching. Clara could feel their eyes crawling over her shoulders, dissecting every patch in her dress, every line in her face, every sign that she wasn't what this man had paid for. She lifted her chin and walked toward the wagon like she'd been invited to a palace instead of a failing cattle ranch in the middle of nowhere. Silas loaded her bag, then offered his hand to help her up. Clara didn't need it, but she took it anyway, seemed polite. He climbed up beside her, released the brake, and snapped the reins. The horses leaned into their harness, and Cedar Bend began to fall away behind them. They didn't speak for the first 20 minutes. The road, if you could call it that, cut through scrubland dotted with sage and the occasional twisted juniper. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow that caught the afternoon light and threw it back like broken glass. The wind had teeth. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and watched the landscape roll past. Silas finally broke the silence. Letters weren't exactly honest, were they? Clara turned to look at him. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. "Which part?" she asked. "The part where I said I was a widow, or the part where I said I could work?" "The part where you made yourself sound like—" He stopped, jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to spit out. "Like someone young and pretty?" Clara finished for him. "Someone who'd make your ranch hands whistle and your neighbors jealous?" His knuckles whitened on the reins. "I didn't say that." "Didn't have to." She looked back at the road. I've been disappointing men since I was tall enough to look them in the eye. You're not special, Mr. Mercer. That got his attention. He glanced at her, something sharp moving behind his eyes. That's supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to be the truth. Clara shifted on the hard bench seat. I didn't cross half the country looking for pity or pretty words. I came here because I need work, and you need help. Your letter said you wanted someone who could run a household, keep books, and wouldn't faint at the sight of blood. I can do all three. If that's not good enough, you can turn this wagon around right now, and I'll take the next train back to Pennsylvania. Silas was quiet for a long moment. The wagon wheels crunched over stones. A hawk circled overhead, riding the wind currents with lazy precision. My wife died 4 years ago, he said finally. Fever took her in 3 days. Since then, I've been running this ranch with hired help and not much else. Place is falling apart. Books are a mess. Half the time, I can't find my own cattle. He paused. I'm not looking for romance, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm looking for a partner who won't run when things get hard. Good, Clara said. Because I'm too old and too tired for romance. But I know how to work, and I keep my promises. He looked at her again, really looked this time. Not the measuring glance from the station platform, but something closer to assessment, like he was trying to figure out what kind of tool he'd just acquired and whether it would hold an edge. All right then, he said. Let's see what you can do. The Mercer Ranch appeared as they crested a low rise, a collection of weathered buildings scattered across a valley floor like dice thrown by a careless hand. The main house was 2 stories, built from rough-cut lumber that had gone gray with age. A barn, a bunkhouse, several corrals, and a handful of outbuildings completed the scene. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, dark shapes against the yellowing grass. It wasn't much, but Clara had learned years ago that not much was often all you got, and what mattered was what you did with it. Silas pulled the wagon up to the main house and set the brake. Bunkhouse is there, he pointed. Kitchen's through the back door. Pantry's stocked but needs organizing. Your room's upstairs, second door on the left. I'm in the room at the end of the hall. Clara climbed down without waiting for help. How many men? 6 including me. Mateo's the trail boss. Older Mexican fellow. Doesn't say much but knows cattle better than anyone in 3 counties. The others are good workers, mostly. He grabbed her carpet bag and headed toward the house. Supper's at 6, breakfast at 5. You don't have to cook if you don't want to. I'll cook. Clara followed him up the porch steps. Part of the arrangement, isn't it? He pushed open the door and stood aside. Most of the arrangement is keeping this place from falling apart completely. Cooking's just part of it. The inside of the house smelled like dust and old coffee, and the particular loneliness of men living without women. The main room held a scarred table, mismatched chairs, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in months. Dishes were piled in a dry sink. The floor needed sweeping. Cobwebs decorated the corners like abandoned lace. Clara set her shawl on a chair and rolled up her sleeves. I'll need hot water, lye soap if you have it, and someone to tell your men there's a woman in the house now, so they'd better knock before entering. Silas almost smiled. Almost. I'll spread the word. He showed her to her room, a small square space with a bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the eastern pastures. It was clean enough, sparse, functional. Clara set her carpet bag on the bed and stood for a moment, looking at the walls that would become familiar, the floor she'd walk across 1,000 times, the window that would frame her mornings. She'd done it. Crossed a continent, arrived at a strange ranch in a strange territory, and nobody had thrown her back on the train. It wasn't much of a victory, but it was hers. By the time the ranch hands came in for supper, Clara had swept the kitchen, scrubbed the worst of the grime off the stove, and managed to turn the available supplies into something resembling stew. It wasn't fancy, just beef, potatoes, onions, and whatever dried herbs she could find. But it was hot, and it filled the house with a smell that seemed to startle the men when they came through the door. They filed in one by one, removing their hats, their eyes finding Clara, and then skittering away like nervous horses. Silas made brief introductions. Mateo Ruiz, the trail boss, 60-something with a face carved from leather and eyes that missed nothing. 2 brothers named James and Thomas Wickham, both young and raw-boned. A quiet hand named Pete, who looked barely 20. And a grizzled old-timer called Dutch, who'd apparently been working cattle since before any of them were born. They sat. They ate. They didn't talk much, but Clara caught them glancing at her when they thought she wasn't looking. Measuring. Wondering. Waiting to see if she'd last longer than a week. After supper, while the men drifted back to the bunkhouse, Clara tackled the dishes. She'd just gotten the water heated when Silas appeared in the doorway. "You don't have to do all this tonight," he said. "Rather do it now than wake up to it tomorrow." Clara scrubbed at a pot with more force than necessary. "Besides, keeps me busy." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You always this stubborn? You always this concerned about dishes?" That almost smile again. "Fair point." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Look, I know this isn't what you expected. Ranch is rougher than I made it sound in the letters. Town's not exactly welcoming, and I'm not—" He stopped, searching for words. "I'm not easy to live with. Just ask anyone who's tried." Clara set the pot aside and turned to face him. "Mr. Mercer, I was married to a drunk who gambled away our farm and died owing money to half of Pennsylvania. I nursed my mother through consumption, buried my father after a wagon accident, and spent the last 2 years cleaning houses for women who thought I was too tall and too plain to be a threat to their husbands. This ranch might be rough, but I've seen worse. And if you're not easy to live with, well," she picked up another pot, "neither am I." Silas regarded her for a long moment. Then he pushed off the door frame, grabbed a dish towel, and started drying the clean pots she'd set aside. They worked in silence, and if it wasn't exactly comfortable, it also wasn't hostile. Outside, the Colorado night was settling in, bringing cold air and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pastures. Somewhere out there, beyond the circle of lamplight and the warmth of the kitchen, the frontier stretched away into darkness, vast, indifferent, and utterly unimpressed by anyone's plans or promises. Clara hung up the dish rag and surveyed her work. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. "I'll see you at breakfast," she said. Silas nodded. 5 o'clock. "I'll be ready." She was ready at 4:30, actually, because old habits died hard, and Clara had learned long ago that being early was better than being caught unprepared. She had coffee boiling and bacon sizzling by the time Silas came downstairs, followed shortly by the sound of boots on the porch as the ranch hands arrived for breakfast. They ate quickly, efficiently, like men who had work waiting and no time to waste. Clara poured coffee, set out biscuits, and tried to get a sense of the rhythm of the place. Ranch life had its own patterns. You could see it in the way the men moved, the way they didn't need to discuss who was doing what. They just knew. Mateo was the last to leave. He paused at the door, hat in hand, and looked at Clara with those sharp old eyes. "You know horses, senora?" he asked. "Well enough," Clara said. He grunted, something that might have been approval. "Good. The bay mare in the second corral, she has a cut on her foreleg. Needs cleaning before it festers." Then he was gone, leaving Clara wondering if that was a test or an assignment or just a statement of fact. She found out an hour later. The bay mare was nervous, dancing sideways when Clara approached with a bucket of warm water and clean rags. Clara talked to her low and steady, the way her father had taught her when she was a girl, learning to handle the big draft horses that pulled their plow. "Easy, girl. Nobody's going to hurt you. Just need to look at that leg. That's it. Easy now." The cut wasn't deep, but it was dirty, probably from barbed wire judging by the ragged edges. Clara cleaned it carefully, applied some of the salve she'd found in the tack room, and wrapped it with a strip of clean cloth. The mare tolerated it, mostly, only trying to kick once and missing by a solid 6 inches. Clara was tying off the bandage when she heard the scream. It came from the direction of the main corral, high, sharp, the kind of sound that meant someone was badly hurt. Clara dropped the bandage and ran. She found them clustered around something on the ground. Pete, the young hand, was writhing in the dirt, his face gray with shock, and his left leg bent at an angle legs weren't supposed to bend. The bone had broken through the skin just above his knee. Claire could see the white edge of it poking through torn denim and flesh. The other men stood frozen, staring like they'd never seen blood before. Silas was kneeling beside Pete, trying to hold him still, but the kid was thrashing and screaming, and nobody seemed to know what the hell to do. Clara pushed through the circle. "Get back. Give me room." Silas looked up, his face tight. "He fell off the fence. Landed wrong." "I can see that." Clara dropped to her knees beside Pete, her mind already sorting through what needed to happen and in what order. Someone get me whiskey. The good stuff, not the rot gut you drink in the bunkhouse. And I need boiling water, clean rags, and strips of leather or canvas I can use for splints. Nobody moved. Now! Clara's voice cracked like a whip. And suddenly the men were scattering, grateful for orders, grateful that someone was doing something other than standing around like fence posts. Pete was still screaming. Clara leaned close, putting her face right in his line of vision. Pete! Pete! Look at me. Look at my eyes. The kid's gaze locked onto hers, wild with pain and terror. You're going to be fine, Clara said, and she made her voice hard and certain, even though she had no idea if it was true. But I need you to stop moving. Can you do that? Can you hold still for me? It hurts. Jesus Christ, it hurts. I know it does, but thrashing around is going to make it worse. Bite down on this. She pulled a leather strap from her belt, the one she'd been using to tie back her hair, and shoved it between his teeth. Bite hard. Don't think about anything else. James came running with a bottle of whiskey. Clara grabbed it, uncorked it with her teeth, and poured a solid measure straight down Pete's throat. He choked, coughed, but some of it got down. She handed the bottle to Silas. Hold him, she said. When I set this bone, he's going to fight. Don't let him move. Silas's eyes widened. You're going to... Clara, we should get the doctor. No, dear. Nearest doctor is 3 hours away, and this kid will be dead from shock or blood loss before we get him there. Now hold him down or get out of my way. For a second, Silas looked like he might argue. Then he nodded and gripped Pete's shoulders, pressing them flat against the ground. Thomas grabbed the kid's good leg. Mateo appeared with an armful of clean rags and a pot of steaming water. Clara poured whiskey over her hands, then over the exposed bone and the torn flesh around it. Pete screamed against the leather strap, his whole body going rigid. Hold him still, Clara ordered, and then she took hold of Pete's broken leg with both hands and pulled. The kid's scream could have shattered glass. Clara felt the bone grate against itself, felt the sickening give of torn muscle and tendon, felt every instinct in her body screaming at her to stop. But she'd done this before, once, back in Pennsylvania, when a farmhand had broken his arm and there was no doctor and no time and no choice. She pulled, twisted slightly, felt the bone slip back into alignment. Pete went limp, unconscious from the pain. Good. Made it easier. Working quickly, Clara cleaned the wound as best she could, packed it with whiskey-soaked rags, and started binding it tight with the strips of canvas Mateo handed her. The makeshift splints went on next, flat pieces of wood from a broken crate, tied in place with leather strips. It wasn't fancy, but it would hold. By the time she finished, Clara's hands were shaking and her dress was soaked with blood and whiskey and sweat. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard, and looked at the circle of men staring at her like she'd just walked on water. Get him inside, she said. Put him on one of the bunks and keep him warm. Change the bandages twice a day. If the wound starts to smell bad or he gets a fever, send someone for the doctor. Silas and Thomas carefully lifted Pete, still unconscious, and carried him toward the bunkhouse. The other hands followed like a funeral procession. Only Mateo stayed behind. The old trail boss looked at Clara for a long moment. Then he bent down, picked up her blood-soaked shawl from where it had fallen in the dirt, and handed it to her. Your father, he said quietly. He drove cattle? Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Thought so. Mateo settled his hat back on his head. A man doesn't teach his daughter to set bone unless he knows she might need it someday. He paused. You did good, senora. That boy would be dead right now if not for you. Then he walked away, leaving Clara alone in the corral with her shaking hands and the adrenaline slowly draining out of her system like water from a cracked bucket. She made it back to the kitchen before her legs gave out, sat down hard in one of the chairs, dropped her head into her hands, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. She'd saved the kid. Probably. Maybe. If infection didn't set in? If she'd set the bone right? If a dozen other things didn't go wrong? The door opened. Silas came in, saw her sitting there, and crossed the room in 3 strides. Are you all right? He crouched beside her chair, his face creased with concern. Clara laughed, a short, sharp sound that might have been hysteria if she'd let it go any further. Am I all right? I just set a compound fracture on your kitchen table before breakfast and you're asking if I'm all right? You did it in the corral, actually. His mouth twitched. And yeah, I'm asking. She looked at him. Really looked. His eyes were steady, genuine. Not the measuring stare from the train platform, not the careful assessment of a man trying to figure out if he'd made a mistake. Just honest concern. I'm fine, Clara said. Just need a minute. Take as long as you need. Silas stood, went to the stove, and poured her a cup of coffee. He set it in front of her, then pulled out a chair and sat down like he had all the time in the world. They sat there in silence while the morning light came through the windows and the ranch slowly came back to life outside. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, Pete was either healing or dying, and there wasn't a damn thing Clara could do about it except wait. My wife couldn't stand the sight of blood, Silas said eventually. Good woman, but she'd faint if you so much as showed her a cut finger. Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, letting the heat seep into her cold fingers. My husband couldn't stand the sight of work. Good man in his way, but he'd find an excuse to avoid anything that looked like effort. What happened to him? Bet on the wrong card game. Man he owed money to came collecting with a knife. Clara took a sip of coffee. They found him in an alley 3 days later. By the time they told me, I'd already lost the farm and everything else. Silas was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. Don't be. He made his choices. She set the cup down. I came west because there was nothing left back there. No family, no money, no prospects. Just a lot of people who looked at me like I was something that should have stayed out of sight. She met his eyes. Your letter said you needed help. Didn't say what kind of help, but I figured anything was better than staying where I wasn't wanted. And now? Silas asked. Now that you've seen the place? Clara looked around the kitchen, at the rough walls, the scarred table, the window that needed caulking before winter. Then she looked at Silas, this man who'd had every reason to send her back to the train station but hadn't. Now, she said slowly, I think maybe I can make something work here. The ranch hands started treating Clara differently after that morning. Not with fear exactly, but with a kind of wary respect usually reserved for unpredictable weather or half-broke horses. They tipped their hats when they saw her. They actually wiped their boots before coming into the kitchen. And when Thomas developed a nasty cough 2 weeks later, he came to Clara instead of suffering in silence. She mixed him a syrup of honey, whiskey, and wild herbs she'd found growing near the creek. He was better in 3 days. After that, they started asking her about other things. Dutch had joint pain. She showed him which plants to steep for tea. James cut his hand on barbed wire. She cleaned it, bandaged it, and told him to keep it dry. Even Mateo, who seemed to consider needing help a personal weakness, came to her when his horse went lame and asked what she thought about the swelling in its hock. Clara settled into the rhythm of the ranch like water finding its level. She woke before dawn, made breakfast, cleaned whatever needed cleaning, and spent the afternoons going through Silas's disaster of a record-keeping system. She found mistakes everywhere, cattle counts that didn't match, sale records that had gone missing, bills that had been paid twice, and others that hadn't been paid at all. How have you stayed in business? She asked Silas one evening after supper, spreading out a year's worth of ledgers across the kitchen table. He rubbed his face, looking tired. Honestly, I have no idea. After Sarah died, I just kind of stopped paying attention to the details. Figured as long as there were cattle on the land and money coming in from sales, the rest would sort itself out. The rest doesn't sort itself out. Clara pointed to a page of numbers. According to this, you should have 240 head of cattle. But according to this, she tapped a different ledger. You only sold 190 last year. So where are the other 50? Silas frowned. Some of them probably died. Winter loss, predators, disease. 50 in 1 year? Clara shook her head. That's not normal loss. That's either terrible luck or something else. What else would it be? Clara didn't answer right away. She'd been noticing things over the past few weeks. Little things that individually meant nothing, but together formed a picture she didn't like. Fence lines that had been cut and poorly repaired, cattle that wandered off and never came back. And twice, she'd seen riders on the ridge to the north, too far away to identify, but close enough to be watching the Mercer Ranch. I don't know yet, she said finally, but I'm going to find out. That night, Clara lay in her narrow bed and listened to the wind howling around the eaves. Winter was coming early this year. She could feel it in the air, See it in the way the cattle were already growing thicker coats, taste it in the cold that seeped through the walls after dark. She thought about Pete, who was healing slowly but surely in the bunkhouse, about the ranch hands who now came to her with their problems, instead of suffering alone, about Silas, who'd looked at her with disappointment that first day, but now looked at her with something closer to partnership. She thought about the missing cattle and the riders on the ridge, and the feeling she couldn't shake that something was very wrong beyond these ranch boundaries. And she thought about the fact that for the first time in years, she was exactly where she needed to be. Not wanted, maybe. Not in the way young brides were wanted, with promises and romance and pretty words, but needed, genuinely, urgently needed. Clara pulled the blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she'd start digging deeper into those ledgers. Tomorrow she'd start asking the kind of questions that people usually didn't want to answer. But tonight, in this rough house on this failing ranch in the middle of the Colorado frontier, Clara Whitmore finally felt like she'd found something worth fighting for. And if there was one thing Clara knew how to do, it was fight. The answer came 3 weeks later, and it came wearing expensive boots. Clara was in the barn organizing supplies when she heard horses approaching, multiple riders, moving at an easy pace that suggested they weren't in any hurry. She straightened, wiping dust off her hands, and walked to the barn door just as Silas emerged from the house. 6 men on horseback pulled up in front of the main house like they owned the place. 5 of them were hired muscle. You could tell by the way they sat their saddles, hands resting easy near their gun belts, eyes scanning the ranch buildings with the practiced assessment of men who got paid to notice things. But it was the 6th man who drew Clara's attention. He was older, maybe 60, with silver hair swept back from a face that had probably been handsome once before arrogance hardened it into something cold. His suit was tailored, his horse was a blood bay that probably cost more than the Mercer Ranch earned in 6 months, and he carried himself with the absolute certainty of a man who'd never been told no in his entire life. "Mercer," the man said, not bothering with a greeting. His voice had the flat authority of someone used to giving orders and having them followed. "We need to talk." Silas's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "Colonel Hale, what brings you out here?" So this was Victor Hale. Clara had heard the name whispered in town. The man who owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, who had his fingers in every business from the rail station to the general store, who controlled the sheriff and half the town council through a combination of money and barely veiled threats. The man who, according to Mateo's carefully worded warnings, didn't take kindly to neighbors who didn't know their place. Hale swung down from his horse with the stiffness of a man whose riding days should have been behind him, but who refused to admit it. "Just being neighborly, wanted to see how you were managing, what with winter coming on and your herd being so diminished lately." "My herd's fine," Silas said. "Is it?" Hale's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Funny thing, my men have been finding strays up near the northern boundary. Unbranded cattle, mostly. Easy to lose track of stock up there, what with all that rough country." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. She stayed where she was, half hidden in the barn doorway, and watched Silas's hands curl into fists at his sides. "Any strays you find with my mark, I'd appreciate having them returned," Silas said carefully. "Oh, we've been very careful about that." Hale pulled off his riding gloves, tucking them into his belt with deliberate slowness. "Very careful indeed. Only take what's clearly marked as mine. Wouldn't want any confusion about ownership." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Clara's mind was already racing, connecting pieces she'd been gathering for weeks. The missing cattle in Silas's records, the riders she'd seen on the northern ridge, the fence lines that had been cut and poorly repaired. And now this. Hale practically admitting he was taking Mercer cattle and rebranding them as his own. "I'll keep that in mind," Silas said, his voice tight. Hale's eyes drifted past Silas to the barn, landing on Clara. His expression shifted. Not quite interest, but something calculating. "And who's this? Don't believe we've met." Clara stepped out of the shadows, meeting his gaze directly. "Clara Whitmore. I'm Mr. Mercer's wife." It wasn't technically true. They'd never made it official. Just let people assume what they wanted to assume. But the lie served its purpose. Hale's eyes narrowed slightly, reassessing. "Wife," he repeated. "Interesting. Didn't know you'd remarried, Mercer." "Didn't know I needed your permission," Silas said flatly. The air went sharp. One of Hale's men shifted in his saddle, hand moving closer to his gun. Clara saw Mateo appear from the direction of the bunkhouse, moving slow but purposeful, rifle held loose in his hands like he just happened to be cleaning it. Dutch and James emerged from the corral, both armed. The odds were still bad, but at least they weren't completely one-sided anymore. Hale noticed. His smile widened, but it was the smile of a snake that had just spotted a mouse and was deciding whether it was hungry enough to strike. "Well then," he said, pulling his gloves back on, "congratulations on your marriage. I hope Mrs. Whitmore understands what kind of place she's landed in." He mounted his horse in one smooth motion. "Hard country out here. Easy for people to get hurt if they're not careful." "We'll manage," Clara said before Silas could respond. Hale looked at her for a long moment, and Clara saw something shift behind his eyes. A recalculation, a reassessment of threat levels. Then he touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of courtesy and wheeled his horse around. "I'm sure you will," he said. "See you around, Mercer." The 6 riders cantered off, kicking up dust that hung in the cold air long after they disappeared over the rise. Nobody moved until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely. Silas let out a breath he'd been holding. "Christ, that man's a snake," Mateo said quietly, lowering his rifle. "Always has been. But he's getting bolder." "He practically admitted he's been stealing our cattle," Clara said, her mind already working through the implications. "Right to your face." Silas turned to look at her. "Our cattle?" "You know what I mean." Clara crossed her arms, feeling the cold now that the adrenaline was fading. "How long has this been going on?" "I don't know. Maybe a year? 2?" Silas scrubbed a hand over his face. "I noticed cattle going missing, but I figured it was normal loss. Never thought someone would be brazen enough to steal from you in broad daylight and dare you to do something about it," Clara finished. "That's exactly what he's doing. And he thinks he can get away with it because he controls the sheriff, the town, and probably half the territory." "He does control all those things," James said from the corral. The young ranch hand looked pale. "My cousin works for Hale. Says the colonel's got dirt on everyone who matters. Anyone who crosses him either falls in line or disappears." "Disappears?" Clara's voice sharpened. James looked uncomfortable. "Accidents, mostly. A man falls off his horse, breaks his neck. Another one gets drunk and drowns in the creek. Nothing you can prove, but the timing's always convenient." Silas's face had gone hard. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because what were you going to do about it?" James shot back. "Go to the sheriff? He's on Hale's payroll. Go to the territorial marshal? By the time they get here, you'd already be dead." He shook his head. "I'm sorry, boss, but some fights you just can't win." Clara watched the defeat settle over Silas's shoulders like a physical weight. She'd seen that look before, on her father's face when the bank came for the farm, on her husband's face the night before he died. The look of a man who'd realized he was caught in a trap with no way out. But Clara had learned something in her 37 years. She'd learned that the worst traps were the ones you believed in, and she'd learned that sometimes the only way out was to stop playing by the rules the trapmaker had set. "There's always a way to fight," she said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. Silas frowned. "Clara, shit. Not with guns," she interrupted. "Not directly, but there are other ways to bring a man down." She looked at Mateo. "You said Hale's been stealing cattle and rebranding them. How does he sell them without anyone noticing?" Mateo thought for a moment. "Ships them out on the railroad. Has a contract with the stockyards in Denver. Probably has paperwork that makes it all look legal." "Paperwork can be forged," Clara said, "but freight records can't. Neither can brand inspections or railroad manifests." She turned to Silas. "Has anyone ever actually checked to see if Hale's shipping numbers match his herd counts?" Silas blinked. No. Why would they?" "But because if he's shipping more cattle than he owns, someone's going to want to know where the extras came from." Clara's mind was racing now, pieces falling into place. "The railroad keeps records. So does the Colorado Cattle Association. And the territorial brand inspector has to sign off on every shipment that crosses state lines." "You want to build a paper case against him?" Dutch sounded skeptical. "Lady, no offense, but Hale's been playing this game for 20 years. You think he's left evidence just lying around?" "No," Clara admitted. "But I think he's gotten comfortable. Comfortable people make mistakes. They get sloppy." She looked at each of them in turn. And even if we can't prove anything criminal, we can make enough noise to attract attention. Federal attention, the kind that even Hale can't buy off. Mateo was studying her with those sharp old eyes. You've done this before. It wasn't a question. Clara met his gaze. My husband owed money to a loan shark who owned half of Pittsburgh City Council. Man thought he was untouchable. She paused. I couldn't get him arrested, but I could make sure the newspapers knew about his business dealings, about which politicians were in his pocket, about where his money came from. Another pause. He was in prison 6 months later, not for what he did to my husband, for tax evasion and bribery, but he was still in prison. Silas was staring at her like she'd just sprouted a second head. You took down a Pittsburgh crime boss? I helped, Claire corrected. The reporters did most of the work. I just gave them the information. And you think we can do the same thing here? I think we can try. Clara looked toward the northern ridge where Hale's riders had disappeared. But it's going to take time, and it's going to be dangerous. If Hale figures out what we're doing before we have enough evidence... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They all knew what men like Hale did to people who threatened their empires. James cleared his throat. I'm in. Everyone looked at him. The young ranch hand shrugged, trying to look braver than he probably felt. I'm tired of watching that bastard steal from good people. If there's a chance to stop him, I want to help. Me too, Thomas said, stepping up beside his brother. Dutch spat into the dirt. Hell, I'm too old to be smart about this kind of thing anyway. Might as well go out doing something useful. Mateo just nodded once. That was all the answer he needed to give. Silas looked at Clara for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. All right, tell us what you need. Clara shook his hand, feeling the calloused grip, seeing the trust in his eyes despite everything that had just happened, despite the danger. Despite the fact that she was asking them all to walk straight into the teeth of the most powerful man in the territory. First, she said, I need every record you have of cattle sales for the past 3 years. Bills of sale, brand inspections, shipping receipts, everything. Second, I need someone who can get into town without attracting attention and start asking questions at the rail station about Hale's shipping schedules. I can do that, Pete said from the doorway of the bunkhouse. The young hand was leaning on a crutch. His broken leg still splinted, but healing well enough that he could move around. Nobody pays attention to a crippled ranch hand. I can hang around the station, listen to gossip, maybe buy a few drinks for the freight clerks. Clara nodded. Good. Third, I need to know everything about Hale's operation. How many employees, where his ranch boundaries are, which neighbors might be willing to talk if they thought they wouldn't get caught. I know a few people, Mateo said slowly. People who've worked for Hale. People who've been on the wrong end of his business deals. They might talk, might not. Try, Clara said. Even rumors help. Even failed deals and old grudges. Anything that gives us leverage. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning, and Clara felt something shift in the air around the ranch. It wasn't hope exactly. None of them were naive enough for that. But it was something. Purpose, maybe. Direction. The feeling that they weren't just going to sit back and let themselves be slowly destroyed. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Clara sat at the kitchen table surrounded by 3 years of Silas's chaotic record-keeping. She'd found a dozen discrepancies already. Cattle that should have been there but weren't, sales that didn't match the numbers in the ledgers, gaps in the timeline that suggested someone had been very carefully removing evidence. The door creaked. Silas came in wearing his coat over his nightshirt, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might need this, he said, setting 1 cup in front of her. You thought right. Clara accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her cold hands around the warm tin. Your bookkeeping is a disaster, by the way. I know. Silas pulled out a chair and sat down. Sarah used to handle all this. After she died, I just couldn't bring myself to deal with it. Kept putting it off until it became this mess. Clara looked at him over the rim of her cup. You loved her. Yeah. His voice was quiet. We grew up together, got married young. He trailed off, searching for words. She was good, kind. Everything about her was gentle. I'm not gentle, Clara said flatly. No, Silas agreed. You're not. He took a sip of coffee. But you're here, and you're fighting for this place like it's yours, and I don't know why. Clara was quiet for a moment, staring at the papers spread across the table. You know why I came west? You said there was nothing left in Pennsylvania. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. Clara set down her cup. When my husband died, I went to his funeral and nobody would look at me. Not because they felt sorry for me, because they blamed me. Said I should have kept him in line, should have stopped his gambling, should have been a better wife. Her laugh was bitter. Never mind that he was a grown man making his own choices. Never mind that I worked myself half to death trying to keep us afloat while he drank and gambled everything away. I was the woman, so it was my fault. Bassemin. Silas didn't say anything, just listened. After they buried him, the loan sharks came for everything we owned. Furniture, clothes, my mother's wedding ring. They took it all. And then the women I'd been cleaning houses for, the ones who'd looked down on me for years, they started offering me jobs. Scrubbing floors, washing their undergarments, emptying their chamber pots. Clara's hands tightened around her cup. They wanted to see me broken. Wanted me on my knees thanking them for the privilege of degrading myself for pennies. So you left. So I left. Clara met his eyes. I came here because I needed work, yes, but also because I needed to prove something. To them, to myself, to everyone who ever looked at me and decided I wasn't worth their respect. She gestured at the papers. This ranch, this fight with Hale, it's not really about cattle or land. It's about refusing to accept that people like him get to win just because they're powerful and cruel. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Thank you, he said simply. Clara looked down at his hand, work roughened, scarred, warm. For what? For being here. For giving a damn. For being the kind of stubborn that doesn't know when to quit. His mouth quirked. For not being gentle. Clara felt something crack open in her chest. Something she'd kept locked down for so long she'd almost forgotten it was there. Not love, not yet, but something close to it, something that felt like possibility. Well, she said, her voice only slightly unsteady, someone has to keep this place from falling apart completely. Seems like, Silas agreed. Then he squeezed her hand once and stood up. Don't stay up too late. We've got work tomorrow. Always do, Clara murmured, already turning back to the ledgers. But she could still feel the warmth of his hand on hers long after he'd gone back upstairs. Over the next 2 weeks, Clara became a woman possessed. She spent every spare moment going through records, comparing numbers, building timelines. Pete came back from town with gossip and shipping schedules. Mateo returned from his quiet visits to neighboring ranches with names and dates and carefully worded testimonies from people who'd been on the wrong end of Hale's business practices. Slowly, carefully, Clara began to construct a picture of Colonel Victor Hale's empire, and all the places where it was built on lies. He's been shipping nearly twice as many cattle as his ranch could possibly support, Clara told Silas one evening, spreading out her notes. Look, here's his brand registration from 1880. He claimed 1,500 head. Even with perfect breeding conditions, he should have maybe 3,000 by now. But according to these railroad manifests Pete copied, he's shipped over 5,000 head in the past 2 years alone. Silas studied the papers. Could be other people's cattle. He runs a brokerage operation, buys from small ranchers and ships in bulk. I thought of that. Clara pulled out another set of papers. But look at the brand inspection certificates. Every single animal is marked as Hale's property. No secondary brands, no bill of sale showing he purchased from other ranchers. According to the paperwork, every cow he ships belongs to him. Which means he's either breeding cattle faster than physically possible, or he's stealing them and rebranding them as his own. Clara tapped the papers. And if we can prove the numbers don't add up, if we can show a federal brand inspector that he's been filing false certificates, we can bring charges that even his bought sheriff can't make disappear. We'd need access to his ranch records, Silas said slowly, his actual herd counts, his breeding logs. Without that, it's just our word against his. Clara smiled, and there was nothing gentle about it. Then we'll get his records. How? I'm still working on that part. The answer came from an unexpected source. 3 days later, a young woman appeared at the ranch driving a wagon loaded with supplies from town. She was maybe 25, pretty in a sharp-edged way, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that assessed everything they landed on. Mrs. Mercer? She asked, climbing down from the wagon. Clara wiped flour off her hands. She'd been making bread. and stepped out onto the porch. "That's right. My name's Catherine Walsh. I work at the general store in town." The young woman glanced around like she was checking for listeners. "Could we talk? Privately?" Clara led her into the kitchen and poured coffee. Catherine accepted the cup but didn't drink, just held it like she needed something to do with her hands. "I heard you've been asking questions about Colonel Hale," Catherine said without preamble. Clara went very still. "Where'd you hear that?" "Pete's not as subtle as he thinks he is. And Cedar Bend's a small town. People notice when a crippled ranch hand starts buying drinks for freight clerks and asking about shipping records." Catherine finally took a sip of coffee. "Most people would pretend they didn't notice. But I'm not most people." "What do you want?" Clara asked carefully. "To help." Catherine set down her cup. "My brother worked for Hale 2 years ago. Good worker, honest, did everything he was told. Then he saw something he wasn't supposed to see. Hale's men rebranding stolen cattle in the middle of the night. He went to the sheriff thinking the law would care." Clara already knew how this story ended. "What happened?" 3 days later, Tom's horse threw him on the way home from town. Broke his neck. Catherine's voice was flat, emotionless. "The sheriff ruled it an accident. Everyone in town knew better, but nobody said a word, because that's what happens when you cross Victor Hale." "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly. "Don't be sorry." Catherine looked up and her eyes were full of cold fury. "Help me hurt him, really hurt him, the way he deserves." Clara studied the young woman across the table, saw the grief and rage buried under the surface, saw the intelligence and determination that had brought her here despite the danger, saw someone who understood exactly what they were up against and chose to fight anyway. "I need information," Clara said. "Records, documents, anything that proves Hale's been falsifying his herd counts and stealing from his neighbors. The kind of evidence that would hold up in federal court." Catherine reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Hale keeps his personal records in a safe at his ranch house. But once a month he brings his account books to town to show his investors, men from Denver and Kansas City who've put money into his operation. They meet at the hotel, 3rd floor, in a private room." "When's the next meeting?" 4 days from now." Catherine slid the paper across the table. "I wrote down the room number and the time. The meeting usually lasts about 2 hours, which means the books will be unguarded in Hale's hotel suite for at least that long." Clara stared at the paper like it might bite her. "You want me to break into his hotel room and steal his account books? I want you to borrow them long enough to copy the relevant pages." Catherine stood up. "I'll be working the desk that night. I can make sure you're not disturbed. But you'll have to move fast. If Hale finds out someone's been in his room, he'll know exactly who to blame." "Why are you doing this?" Clara asked. "If you get caught—" "I know what happens if I get caught." Catherine's voice was hard. "But I've been watching that man destroy people for 2 years, and I'm tired of being too scared to do anything about it. So either we're doing this or we're not. What's it going to be?" Clara thought about Silas, about the ranch, about all the people who'd been quietly suffering under Hale's boot for years because fighting back seemed impossible. Thought about the ledgers upstairs full of missing cattle and unexplained losses. Thought about the look on Hale's face when he'd threatened them in their own yard. "We're doing it," she said, but I need help. Someone who can copy documents fast and keep their mouth shut." Catherine smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "I know just the person." 4 days later, Clara found herself standing in the hallway of Cedar Bend's only hotel, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone in the building must be able to hear it. She wore her best dress, which still wasn't much, and carried a carpet bag that supposedly contained sewing supplies. What it actually contained was blank paper, pencils, and a camera she'd borrowed from a traveling photographer who owed Catherine's family a favor. Catherine was behind the front desk, chatting with a guest like this was just another ordinary evening. She caught Clara's eye and gave the tiniest nod toward the stairs. "Room 307, 3rd floor." Clara climbed the stairs on legs that felt made of water, counting doors until she found the right one. She pulled out the key Catherine had provided, lifted from Hale's coat pocket that afternoon when he'd stopped by the store, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. The lock turned. The door opened. Clara slipped inside and closed it behind her, breathing hard. Hale's hotel suite was nicer than any place Clara had ever been in her life. Thick carpet, heavy furniture, actual paintings on the walls. And there, on the desk by the window, exactly where Catherine said they'd be. 3 leather-bound ledgers. Clara moved fast. She opened the carpet bag, pulled out the camera, and started photographing pages. She didn't try to read them, didn't try to understand what they meant. Just click, turn, trying to move quickly without making noise. She'd gotten through the first ledger and was halfway through the second when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Clara froze. The footsteps stopped outside the door. For 5 seconds that felt like 5 years, nothing happened. Then whoever it was moved on, their steps fading toward the end of the hall. Clara forced herself to breathe again, forced her shaking hands to keep working. Click, turn. The second ledger was done. She started on the third. More footsteps. Closer this time. Clara's hands were sweating so badly she almost dropped the camera. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. The doorknob started to turn. Clara grabbed the ledgers, shoved them back exactly where she'd found them, and dove behind the heavy curtains by the window. The door opened. Someone stepped inside. Through the gap in the curtains, Clara could see Colonel Hale himself, walking to the desk, picking up something he'd forgotten. A cigar case. He stood there for a moment, looking around the room like something felt wrong, but he couldn't quite figure out what. Clara held her breath. Didn't move. Didn't even blink. Hale shrugged, pocketed the cigar case, and walked back out. The door closed. His footsteps receded down the hall. Clara waited until she couldn't hear anything, then waited another full minute just to be sure. Then she came out from behind the curtain, grabbed the third ledger, and photographed the rest of the pages so fast her hands were practically blurs. She put everything back exactly as it had been, checked the room one more time to make sure she hadn't left any evidence, and slipped back out into the hallway. Down the stairs, past Catherine, who didn't even look up from her paperwork, and out into the cold November night. She made it 2 blocks before her legs gave out, sat down hard on a bench outside the closed general store, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Now she just had to hope the photographs were clear enough to use. The photographs came back from the developer in Denver 3 days later, smuggled onto the ranch inside a shipment of winter supplies. Clara spread them across the kitchen table with hands that trembled slightly. Not from fear this time, but from something closer to vindication. The numbers were all there. Herd counts that didn't match shipping records. Brand certificates filed with the territorial office that contradicted Hale's own internal ledgers. Payments to the sheriff listed as consultation fees alongside notations that made it clear what was really being purchased. And buried in the third ledger, a list of properties Hale had acquired over the past 5 years. Not through purchase, but through foreclosure, theft, and what the ledger euphemistically called negotiated transfers. Silas leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the photographs. Is that what I think it is? If you think it's proof that Hale's been running a criminal enterprise for at least 5 years, then yes. Clara pulled out one particular photograph. Look at this entry from September of '82. He shipped 470 head to the Denver stockyards. But according to his own herd count from that same month, he only had 320 cattle on his entire ranch. Where'd the other 150 come from? Exactly. Clara tapped the photograph. And look at the dates. Every time his shipping numbers spike, it's right after one of his neighbors reports cattle missing. He's not even trying to hide it. He just knows nobody's going to check. Mateo had been standing in the doorway, listening. Now he stepped forward, his weathered face grim. This is enough to hang him. Maybe, Clara said carefully, if we can get it in front of the right people. Federal marshals, brand inspectors who aren't on his payroll, maybe someone from the Colorado Cattle Association. She started gathering the photographs into a neat stack. But we need more than just these numbers. We need physical evidence. We need to catch him in the act. You want to catch him stealing cattle? Silas shook his head. Clara, that's suicide. You saw how many men he rides with. I don't want to catch him personally. I want to find cattle on his property that still carry other people's brands under his alterations. Clara looked up at Mateo. You said the northern pasture. That's where you've seen his men working at night? See. Mateo's expression was troubled. But it's a long ride, and the weather's turning. We get caught out there in a storm. Oh! Then we don't get caught. Clara stood up, rolling her shoulders to ease the tension that had been building there for days. We ride out before dawn, find what we need to find, and get back before anyone knows we were there." "And if Hale's men are already there?" Silas asked. Clara met his eyes. "Then we're very, very quiet." They left the next morning in the dark hour before sunrise, when the world was nothing but shapes and shadows, and the cold bit through every layer of clothing like it had teeth. Clara rode the bay mare, the one whose leg she'd treated all those weeks ago, while Silas and Mateo flanked her on their own mounts. The plan was simple. Ride to the northern boundary of the Mercer property, cross into the disputed territory where Hale's men had been seen working, find evidence of rebranded cattle, and get out. Simple plans had a way of going wrong. They'd been riding for maybe 2 hours, the sky just starting to lighten in the east, when Mateo held up a hand. Everyone stopped. Clara's mare snorted, breath steaming in the frigid air. "What is it?" Silas whispered. Mateo pointed toward a low rise ahead of them. Clara squinted and saw what he'd seen: smoke. Just a thin ribbon of it, barely visible against the gray sky, but unmistakable. "Someone's camped up there," Mateo said quietly. "Could be Hale's men, could be drifters. Either way, we need to go around." They swung wide, moving through a stand of bare cottonwoods that rattled in the wind like skeleton fingers. The smoke fell away behind them, and Clara started breathing easier. Then they crested a ridge and saw the cattle. There were maybe 30 head grazing in a small valley, scattered across the sparse grass. At this distance, Clara couldn't make out the brands clearly, but something about the way they were clustered, tight together, nervous, suggested they hadn't been there long. "Wait here," Silas said, dismounting. He handed his reins to Clara. "I'm going to get a closer look." "Not alone, you're not." Mateo swung down from his own horse. "Clara, you stay with the animals. If you hear shooting, you ride like hell back to the ranch and don't stop for anything. Understand?" Clara wanted to argue, but the look in both men's eyes told her this wasn't the time. "Be careful." They moved down the slope on foot, keeping low, using what little cover the terrain offered. Clara watched them go, her heart climbing into her throat. The wind was picking up now, carrying the smell of snow. The sky had gone the color of old iron. She waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Then she heard the voices. They came from the direction of the smoke. Male voices, rough and carrying. Clara's hands tightened on the reins as she saw riders emerge from the trees below. 4 of them, all armed, moving at a lazy pace like they owned everything they could see. Hale's men. Had to be. Clara looked down the slope where Silas and Mateo had disappeared. They were completely exposed down there, crouched beside one of the steers, examining something. If the riders came any closer, there'd be no way to hide. She had maybe 30 seconds to decide what to do. Clara did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed Silas's rifle from his saddle, checked that it was loaded, and fired a single shot into the air. The crack echoed across the valley like thunder. The 4 riders jerked their horses to a stop, hands going to their guns. Down the slope, Silas and Mateo looked up, saw the riders, and started running. "Go!" Clara screamed, already wheeling her mare around. "Move!" Gunfire erupted behind her. Clara heard bullets whine past her head, heard someone shouting orders, heard the pounding of hooves as the riders kicked their horses into pursuit. She didn't look back, just dug her heels into the mare's sides and rode. Silas and Mateo caught up to her within seconds, their horses running flat out. More gunshots cracked across the cold morning air. Something tugged at Clara's coat, a bullet passing close enough to pull the fabric. The mare stumbled, caught herself, kept running. "The trees!" Mateo yelled, pointing toward a thick stand of pine about a quarter-mile ahead. "We make it there, we might lose them. They might also get pinned down and killed," but Clara didn't waste breath saying so. She just rode, low over the mare's neck, praying to anything listening that the horse's footing would hold. They crashed into the trees at full speed, branches whipping at Clara's face and arms. Behind them, the riders were closing, their shouts getting louder. Silas's horse went down, just stumbled and fell, throwing him hard into the dirt. Clara yanked her mare around, circling back. "Get up!" Silas was already moving, but his left side was covered in blood. Clara's heart stopped. "You're hit." "Just grazed," Silas gasped, but his face was white with pain. "Keep going. Like hell." Clara reached down, grabbed his arm, and hauled him up behind her with strength she didn't know she had. The mare staggered under the extra weight, but held steady. Another bullet cracked past them, This one so close Clara felt the heat of it. Mateo's rifle barked in response, once, twice, and one of the pursuing riders went down. The others scattered, taking cover, and in that brief window of respite, they ran. Clara didn't know how long they rode. Time stopped meaning anything. There was just the mare's laboring breath, Silas's weight against her back, the burning in her own lungs, and the sound of pursuit that never quite faded away. The sky was starting to spit snow now, tiny, hard flakes that stung her face. They emerged from the trees onto open ground, and Clara's heart sank. No cover, nowhere to hide. The riders would see them, run them down, and that would be the end of it. Then Mateo shouted something in Spanish and pointed. Clara looked and saw it, a narrow ravine cutting across the landscape, hidden by sage and tumbleweeds until you were almost on top of it. They plunged down into it, horses sliding on the loose rock, and found themselves in a channel barely wide enough for the animals to move single file. The walls rose 10 feet on either side, blocking the wind but also blocking any escape route. "This way," Mateo hissed, urging his horse forward. "There's a place up ahead where the ravine forks. We can hide there." They followed him deeper into the cut, the walls narrowing until Clara could reach out and touch both sides. Behind them, she heard the riders reach the ravine, heard them arguing about whether to follow. Then the sky opened up. Snow came down in a solid wall, so thick Clara couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The temperature dropped like someone had thrown a switch. Within minutes, the ground was white, the air was white. Everything was white except for the dark shapes of the horses and the men. "We can't stay here," Silas shouted over the wind. His voice was getting weaker. "We'll freeze!" "Can't go back either," Mateo called from somewhere ahead. "Those men are still up there." Clara made a decision. How far to shelter? Maybe a mile. There's an old line shack on the eastern boundary. Hasn't been used in years, but it should still have walls and a roof. Then that's where we're going. Silas, can you hold on? The man behind her didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. Clara felt his grip loosening, felt him starting to slump. "Silas!" She reached back, grabbed his arm, held him upright through sheer force of will. "Stay with me. You hear me? Stay awake." "Trying," he mumbled. "Cold." The storm got worse. Clara had lived through Pennsylvania winters, but this was different. This was the kind of cold that killed you if you weren't careful, that crept into your bones and made you stupid and slow until you just lay down in the snow and never got up. She kept the mare moving by instinct more than sight, following Mateo's horse, trusting that the old trail boss knew where he was going. Her hands had gone numb on the reins. Silas's weight felt like dead weight now, and she had to keep talking to him, keep him responding, keep him conscious. "Tell me about your wife," she said, the words almost torn away by the wind. "Tell me about Sarah." "Sarah?" Silas's voice was distant, dreamy. She had yellow hair, like sunshine. "What else?" "She sang all the time, drove me crazy sometimes, but I loved it." "Keep talking." "What did she sing?" "Old songs, church songs, made-up songs about the chickens." Clara almost laughed. "Songs about chickens?" She named them all, had whole stories about their lives. Silas's voice was getting fainter. "Thought I was foolish for marrying her, everyone did. Said I should find someone practical." "Sounds like you found what you needed at the time." "Yeah." A pause. "What about you? Your husband, what was his name?" "Edward." Clara's jaw was clenched so hard it hurt. "Edward Whitmore, and he was a bastard who couldn't leave the cards alone." "But you married him." "I was 18 and stupid, and he was charming when he wanted to be." The lined shack appeared through the snow like a ghost, a dark shape that became walls, became a roof, became salvation. "Almost there. Hold on." They reached the shack, and Clara practically fell off the mare, her legs so numb she couldn't feel them. Mateo was already off his horse, forcing open the warped door. Clara grabbed Silas and half-dragged, half-carried him inside. The interior was dark, smelled like mice and rot and old wood, but it was out of the wind. Mateo got the horses inside too. The shack was bigger than it looked from outside, probably built to shelter animals as well as men. He shut the door, and the howling of the storm became muffled, distant. "Get his coat off," Mateo ordered, already moving to check Silas's wound. "Need to see how bad it is." Clara's fingers were so cold she could barely work the buttons, but she got the coat off. Silas's shirt was soaked with blood on the left side, and when Mateo tore the fabric away, Clara saw the wound, a deep furrow across his ribs, not life-threatening, but bad enough. "Bullet grazed him," Mateo said. "Took a chunk of meat, but didn't hit anything vital. He's lost blood, though, and he's going into shock. We need heat." There was a small stove in the corner, rusty and probably dangerous, but it was better than nothing. Clara found old newspapers and broken furniture, anything that would burn, while Mateo used his knife to cut strips from a relatively clean horse blanket for bandages. Getting the fire started took forever with numb fingers and damp kindling, but Clara had learned patience the hard way. She worked methodically, protecting the tiny flame, feeding it carefully until it caught and spread and started throwing real heat. Once the fire was going, she turned back to Silas. Mateo had gotten the wound cleaned and bandaged, but the man was shivering violently, his lips blue. "Hypothermia," Mateo said quietly. "We need to warm him up, fast." They got Silas as close to the stove as they dared, piled every available piece of fabric on top of him, and Clara sat beside him, checking his pulse every few minutes. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the three of them huddled around the tiny fire and tried to survive. "Did you see the brands?" Clara asked after a while, her voice hoarse from the cold. Mateo nodded. "Mercer brand, fresh burned over with Hale's mark. Sloppy work, too. You could still see the original if you looked close. That steer wasn't even fully healed from the rebranding. So we have proof. We have proof that'll get us killed if we try to use it." Mateo fed another piece of wood to the fire. "Those men saw us. They'll report back to Hale. He'll know we were snooping around his operation." Clara stared at the flames. He was right. They'd gotten the evidence they needed, but they'd also painted a target on their backs. Hale would come for them now, not with lawyers or paperwork, but with guns and men who knew how to make deaths look like accidents. "Then we move fast," she said. "We get this evidence to people who can act on it before Hale has a chance to shut us down." "You mean the territorial marshal?" "I mean everyone. The marshal, the cattle association, the Denver newspapers, the federal brand inspector, everyone at once. Make so much noise that Hale can't silence us without making things worse for himself." Mateo studied her for a long moment. "You know he'll come after us anyway. Man like that doesn't let challenges go unanswered." "I know." Clara looked down at Silas, who'd finally stopped shivering and fallen into an uneasy sleep. "But what's the alternative? Let him keep stealing? Keep destroying people? Keep winning just because everyone's too scared to fight back?" Most people would say yes. Most people would say staying alive is more important than being right. Most people aren't watching someone they... Clara stopped, the words catching in her throat. Watching someone they what? Cared about? Loved? She barely knew Silas Mercer, barely knew any of these people. But somewhere along the way, this ranch and these people had stopped being a job and started being something else. "Most people aren't as stubborn as you," Mateo finished, and there might have been approval in his voice. Or resignation. Hard to tell with Mateo. The storm blew itself out sometime after midnight. Clara woke from a doze to find pale moonlight streaming through the gaps in the walls and silence pressing in from all sides. Silas was awake too, propped against the wall, his face still pale but his eyes clearer. "How long was I out?" he asked. "Few hours." Clara moved to check his bandages. The bleeding had stopped, but the wound looked angry and inflamed. "How do you feel?" "Like I got shot and then rode through a blizzard." He winced as she prodded the bandage. "Could be worse, though. Could be dead." "Yeah." Silas caught her hand, held it. "Thank you for coming back for me." Clara looked at their joined hands, hers rough and scarred, his equally work-worn. "You would have done the same." "Maybe. But you actually did it." He paused. "You rode back into gunfire, pulled me onto your horse, and outran 4 armed men in a snowstorm. That's not nothing, Clara." She wanted to make a joke, deflect the moment, but the look in his eyes stopped her. There was something raw there, something honest that deserved an honest response. "I couldn't leave you," she said simply. "I just couldn't." Silas pulled her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles. The gesture was old-fashioned, courtly, completely at odds with their current situation, bleeding and freezing in a half-collapsed line shack while a killer's men hunted them through the snow. Clara felt something crack in her chest, something that had been frozen for a long time starting to thaw. "We should probably talk about what happens next," she said, her voice not quite steady. "Next, we get back to the ranch, gather everything we have, and start sending messages to every authority figure we can think of." Silas was still holding her hand. "After that, we prepare for Hale to come calling. And if he comes with more men than we can handle, then we make him regret it." Silas's expression hardened. "I've been letting that bastard push me around for too long, letting him steal my cattle, my land, my dignity. I'm done. Whatever happens, I'm done backing down." Clara nodded. "Good. Because I didn't cross half a continent and survive a gunfight just to surrender now." They rode back to the ranch in the gray dawn, 3 people on 2 horses, moving slow through snow that came up to the animals' knees. The world was silent except for the crunch of hooves and the labored breathing of tired horses. Beautiful and deadly in equal measure. The ranch came into view like a promise. The hands must have been watching for them because Dutch and James came running before they even reached the barn, faces tight with worry. "We heard shooting," Dutch said, helping Silas down from Clara's horse. "Been watching the North Ridge all night, figured you were either dead or holed up somewhere." "Second one," Silas grunted, leaning heavily on Dutch's shoulder. "Get me inside. Clara needs to send some telegrams." "I need to get you patched up properly first," Clara argued, but Silas was already shaking his head. "Telegrams first. I'll live another hour. Might not live much longer if we don't get this information out." "He was right, damn him." Clara turned to Pete, who'd come limping out of the bunkhouse. "How fast can you get to town?" "Hour and a half if I push it. Why?" Clara pulled a folded paper from inside her coat. She'd written it last night by firelight while Silas slept, working out exactly what needed to be said and to whom. "Take this to the telegraph office. Send copies to every name on this list. Don't stop. Don't talk to anyone except the telegraph operator. And if anyone asks what you're doing, you're sending birthday wishes to your aunt in St. Louis. Understand?" Pete took the paper, scanned the list of names. His eyes widened. "This is... Clara, this is the territorial governor and the U.S. Marshal for Colorado, and I know who it is. Can you do it or not?" "I can do it." Pete folded the paper carefully and tucked it inside his shirt. "But once these go out, there's no taking them back. Hale will know we're moving against him." "He already knows." Clara gestured toward Silas, toward the blood-soaked bandages and the pallor of near death. "His men tried to kill us this morning. We're past the point of subtle." Pete nodded and headed for the barn to saddle a horse. Clara watched him go, feeling the weight of what she'd just set in motion settling onto her shoulders like a physical thing. Catherine arrived 3 hours later, driving her wagon like the devil was chasing her. She pulled up in front of the house and jumped down without bothering to set the brake. "They know," she said without preamble. "Hale's men are all over town asking questions. They're saying you trespassed on Hale's property, that you tried to steal his cattle, that Silas shot first." Of course they are. Claire had been expecting this. Did Pete get the telegrams out? Sent everyone before Hale's men even knew to watch the telegraph office. The operator's a friend. He'll keep his mouth shut. Catherine looked toward the house. "How's Silas?" "Alive, angry, planning something stupid, probably." Clara rubbed her face. "How long do we have?" "Before Hale comes here? Maybe a day, maybe less." Catherine lowered her voice. "Word is he's gathering men. Not just his regular hands, hired guns from Denver. Men who do this kind of work for money." Clara felt ice settle in her stomach. "How many?" "I don't know. 10, 15? Enough that you can't fight them off with 6 ranch hands and a wounded boss." "Then we don't fight them." Clara's mind was already racing, sorting through options, discarding the impossible, focusing on what might actually work. "We make sure that if anything happens to us, Hale goes down too." She spent the rest of the day writing. Letters, affidavits, sworn statements, everything she could think of that would preserve the evidence even if they weren't around to present it themselves. She made copies, sealed them in separate envelopes, and gave them to Catherine with strict instructions. "One goes to the Denver Post," Clara said, "one to the territorial governor's office, one to the Cattle Association, and this one," she held up a 4th envelope, "this one you keep hidden unless something happens to me or Silas. If we disappear, if there's an accident, anything suspicious, you open this and follow the instructions inside, understand?" Catherine took the envelopes, her face somber. I understand. Good. Clara walked her back to the wagon. And Catherine, thank you for everything. Your brother would be proud. Something flickered in Catherine's eyes. Grief? Determination? Maybe both. Let's make sure we're around to see Hale get what he deserves. That's the plan. After Catherine left, Clara finally let herself sit down. Every muscle in her body ached. Her hands were blistered from the rains, her face was raw from the wind, and she was pretty sure she had frostbite on at least 3 toes. But they'd done it. They'd gotten the evidence out, made enough noise that Hale couldn't simply make them disappear without consequences. Now they just had to survive long enough for those consequences to matter. Silas found her in the kitchen an hour later. He'd changed his bloody shirt and someone had rebandaged his wound properly. But he still moved like every step hurt. You should be resting, Clara said. I should be a lot of things. He lowered himself carefully into a chair across from her. Pete told me what you sent. Every territorial authority, the federal marshal, 3 newspapers, and the head of the cattle association. Seemed like enough to start with. Clara. Silas waited until she looked at him. If this works, Hale will spend the rest of his life in prison. His empire will collapse. Every crooked deal he's made, every politician he's bought, every bit of influence he's spent 20 years building, it'll all come down. I know. And if it doesn't work, he'll kill us. Not quickly, not cleanly. He'll make an example of us so thorough that nobody will ever think about crossing him again. Clara met his eyes. I know that too. And you're okay with that? She thought about it. Really thought about it. Thought about the woman who'd stepped off that train 2 months ago, all sharp edges and old wounds and desperation. Thought about everything that had happened since, the cattle, the ledgers, the photographs, the gunfight. Thought about these people who'd become something like family without her quite noticing when it happened. I'm not okay with dying, she said slowly, but I'm okay with fighting. I'm okay with standing up to a man who's been hurting people just because he can. And if that gets me killed, she shrugged. At least I went down swinging instead of just accepting that this is how things are. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. When this is over, he said, assuming we're both still breathing, I want to marry you. Properly. Not just let people assume. Actually stand up in front of witnesses and make it official. Clara's breath caught. Silas, and I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other. But I've watched you save this ranch, save my life, save yourself over and over again. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Clara Whitmore. And I'd be honored if you'd consider being my wife for real. Clara looked at their joined hands, looked at this man who'd seen her at her worst and her best, and decided he wanted to keep her anyway. Felt something warm and terrifying unfold in her chest. Ask me again when we're not about to die, she said. If we survive this, I'll give you an answer. Silas smiled, a real smile this time, not the careful half thing he usually allowed himself. Deal. They sat there in the fading afternoon light, hands clasped across the scarred kitchen table, and waited for whatever came next. What came next arrived 2 days later, just after noon, when the winter sun was weak and the temperature had dropped low enough to freeze the water in the horse trough solid. Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, shirts and long underwear snapping in the bitter wind, when she heard Mateo's voice from the barn, sharp and urgent. Riders coming. Maybe 8 of them. Maybe... Clara dropped the shirt she'd been pinning and ran for the house. By the time she reached the porch, everyone was already moving. Silas emerging from the bunkhouse despite his injury, Dutch and James grabbing rifles, Thomas positioning himself by the barn with a clear line of sight to the road. They'd been drilling this for 2 days, preparing for exactly this moment, but Clara's heart was still trying to hammer its way out of her chest. The riders came over the rise in a tight formation, moving slow and deliberate. Colonel Victor Hale rode at the center on his expensive bay, flanked by men who looked like they'd been hired for their ability to hurt people and their willingness to do it for money. Clara counted 9 total, more than Mateo had initially called out. Bad odds. Worse than bad. Silas stepped up beside her on the porch, rifle held loose in his hands. His face was pale, but his jaw was set. Stay behind me. The hell I will. Clara had Silas's revolver tucked in the waistband of her skirt, hidden under her apron. Her hands were shaking, but she kept them still by force of will. We do this together or not at all. The riders stopped about 30 yards from the house, close enough to talk, far enough to make any shooting a deliberate choice. Hale dismounted with that same stiff pride, brushing dust from his expensive coat like he was arriving at a social call instead of what was clearly a threat. "Mercer," he said, his voice carrying across the cold air, "we need to have a conversation." "Then talk," Silas said flatly, "but your men stay on their horses." Hale smiled, that snake smile that never touched his eyes. "I don't take orders on other people's property, but I'll make this quick since I'm a busy man." He took a few steps forward, hands clasped behind his back. "You've been spreading lies about me, sending telegrams to people who don't understand how business works out here, making accusations that could damage my reputation." "Accusations?" Clara spoke up before Silas could respond. "You mean documented proof of cattle theft and brand fraud?" Hale's attention swung to her, and Clara saw something cold and reptilian move behind his eyes. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Mercer. The woman with the busy hands and busier mouth." He looked her up and down with contempt that was almost palpable. "You're new here, so let me explain how things work in this territory. Men like me, we built this place. We made it safe for settlement, created businesses, brought civilization to wilderness. And in return, we get certain privileges, certain understandings about how things operate. Understandings like stealing your neighbor's blind and threatening anyone who objects." Clara kept her voice level, conversational. "That kind of civilization?" One of Hale's men laughed, short, sharp, quickly silenced by a look from the colonel. Hale's smile didn't waver, but something dangerous flickered in his expression. "Careful, Mrs. Mercer. That mouth of yours could get you in trouble." "Already in trouble?" Clara said. "Your men tried to kill us 3 days ago. So let's not pretend this is about conversation." "My men," Hale said slowly, "were protecting my property from trespassers. If shots were fired, it was in self-defense." He turned back to Silas. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to send new telegrams retracting everything you said. You're going to admit you were mistaken, that you acted rashly based on poor information. And then you're going to sell me this ranch for a fair price and move on to somewhere less complicated." "And if I don't?" Silas asked. "Then I'll make your life very difficult. Your cattle will keep disappearing. Your credit at the general store will dry up. Your ranch hands will find better opportunities elsewhere." Hale's voice was almost pleasant. "Accidents will happen, people will get hurt, and eventually you'll sell anyway, but for much less money and with much more regret." Clara felt the rage building in her chest, hot and sharp and dangerous. This man, this entitled, cruel bastard who thought he could just take whatever he wanted because he'd always gotten away with it before. "You're going to prison," she said, and her voice came out hard and certain. "Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but the evidence is already out there. The territorial marshal has it. The Cattle Association has it. 3 different newspapers have it. You can threaten us all you want, but you can't threaten everyone." Hale's expression finally cracked, just for a second, but Clara saw it. Saw the flash of uncertainty, of genuine concern that maybe, just maybe, he'd miscalculated. Then his face smoothed out again and he shook his head almost pityingly. "You really don't understand how this works, do you? I know the territorial marshal. I've had dinner with him 6 times. The Cattle Association? I'm on the board. And newspapers?" He laughed. "Newspapers need advertisers. They need people who can make or break them with a word. You think some photographs and accusations from a failed rancher and his mail-order bride are going to bring me down?" "I think arrogance makes men stupid," Clara said. "And you've been getting away with this for so long you've forgotten that eventually someone fights back." "People fight back all the time," Hale said quietly. "They just don't win." He turned and walked back toward his horse, but stopped halfway and looked back. "You have until tomorrow night. Retract your statements and sell, or face the consequences. Your choice." "We're not selling," Silas said. Hale mounted his horse, gathering the reins with the ease of long practice. "Then I'll be back in 3 days to make an offer to your widow." He looked directly at Clara. "Assuming there's anything left to offer for." The 9 riders turned and cantered away, leaving a cloud of dust and the smell of horse sweat and the kind of silence that follows clear and unambiguous threats. Nobody moved for a long moment, Then Silas lowered his rifle and let out a breath that might have been a laugh or might have been something closer to despair. "Well, son," he said, "that went about as badly as possible." "Could have been worse," Dutch offered. "Could have shot us." "He's saving that for later." Mateo was watching the ridge where the riders had disappeared, his expression grim. 3 days, he said. "That's how long we have to prepare." Prepare for what?" Thomas asked. "We're 6 men and a woman against at least 9 hired killers. What kind of preparation makes those odds work?" Clara was already thinking, her mind racing through possibilities and discarding most of them as fast as they appeared. They couldn't win a straight fight. Couldn't run. Hale would just hunt them down. Couldn't trust the local law because Hale owned it. But they had sent out the evidence, had made enough noise that Hale couldn't simply make them disappear without questions being asked. The question was whether help would arrive before Hale's patience ran out. "We make this place defensible," Clara said slowly. "Stock up on supplies, ammunition, water, board up windows, create firing positions. Make it costly enough that even if Hale wins, he loses men doing it. Men talk, and hired guns don't like dying for someone else's grudge." Silas was looking at her with an expression that might have been admiration or might have been concern. "You're talking about a siege." "I'm talking about surviving long enough for the law to actually show up." Clara turned to Pete. "How long before we could expect a response to those telegrams?" "Territorial Marshal's office is in Denver. 3 days to get the message, maybe another day to verify, another 2 days to ride out here if they take it seriously." Pete did the math in his head. Week, minimum. More likely 10 days. "We don't have 10 days, James said quietly. "Then we buy time." Clara looked at each of them in turn. These men who'd become something more than just ranch hands, who'd become allies and friends. "We make Hale think we're considering his offer. Send him a message tomorrow saying we need time to discuss terms. That buys us another few days at least." "He won't believe it," Mateo said. "Doesn't matter if he believes it, just matters if it makes him hesitate." Clara was already moving toward the house. "Come on, we've got work to do." They spent the rest of that day and all of the next turning the ranch into something that could withstand an attack. Dutch and Thomas reinforced the doors and shuttered the windows. James and Pete stockpiled ammunition and organized the weapons. Mateo rode the property line, checking for weak points and alternate approaches. And Clara worked on the details that nobody else thought about, moving all the food stores into the main house, filling every available container with water, preparing medical supplies in case someone else got shot. Silas tried to help despite his injury, but Clara finally ordered him to sit down before he tore his stitches open. "I'm not useless," he argued, lowering himself carefully into a kitchen chair. "Never said you were, but you're recovering from a gunshot wound, and you'll be more useful directing people than trying to lift boards with one working side." Clara handed him paper and a pencil. "Write that message to Hale. Make it sound convincing." Silas stared at the blank paper for a long moment. Then he started writing, the pencil scratching across the page in the quiet kitchen. Clara watched him work, noting the furrow between his eyebrows, the way he chewed his bottom lip when he was thinking. Such a small, human detail. She'd been noticing more of them lately, the way his hands moved when he talked, the rare laugh that transformed his whole face, the gentleness he showed with the horses even when he was exhausted. "What?" Silas asked, catching her staring. "Nothing," Clara said. "Just thinking." "About?" "About how different this is from what I expected when I stepped off that train." Silas set down the pencil. "Good, different, or bad different?" Clara thought about it honestly. Thought about the fear and the danger, and the very real possibility that they'd all be dead within the week. Thought about the gunfight, and the blizzard, and the moment when she'd thought Silas was going to die in her arms. "Both," she admitted. "This is harder than anything I've ever done. Scarier, too. But it's also the first time in years I've felt like I was fighting for something that mattered instead of just trying to survive." "The ranch?" "The people." Clara met his eyes. "You, Mateo, the boys. Even stubborn old Dutch. You all took a chance on someone nobody wanted, and you treated me like I belonged here from the first day I set that kid's broken leg. That's worth fighting for." Silas reached across the table and caught her hand. When this is over, you're going to ask me a question and I'm going to say yes," Clara interrupted. "But let's survive first." His smile was crooked, tired, and absolutely genuine. "Deal." Pete delivered the message to Hale's ranch the next morning, writing back with a response that was exactly what Clara expected. Hale would send someone to discuss terms in 2 days. It was a lie, obviously. Hale had no intention of negotiating, but it bought them time, and time was the only currency they had. The ranch hands took turns on watch duty, 2 men always awake and armed while the others tried to rest. Clara found she couldn't sleep much anyway, so she spent the dark hours organizing supplies and writing letters. Letters to Catherine with instructions in case they didn't make it. Letters to the territorial governor providing additional details about Hale's operation. Letters to people she barely knew, but who might care enough to act. On the 3rd night after Hale's visit, Clara was checking the boarded windows when she heard Mateo's low whistle from the barn. The signal they'd agreed meant trouble coming. She grabbed the rifle leaning against the wall and ran outside. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to see the line of riders silhouetted against the pale sky. More than before. Clara counted at least 15, maybe more. "Everyone up!" Silas was already moving, shouting orders despite the pain it clearly caused him. "Positions! Now!" The ranch hands scattered to their assigned places, Dutch and James in the barn with clear shots toward the road, Thomas in the loft of the bunkhouse, Pete and Mateo flanking the main house. Clara and Silas took position on the porch, rifles ready. But the riders stopped at the property line and didn't advance, just sat there on their horses, watching, waiting, making their presence known. "What are they doing?" Thomas called from the bunkhouse. "Trying to scare us," Silas said. "Let us see how many men he brought. Make us think about what happens when they come for real." Clara felt the cold settle into her bones, and it had nothing to do with the temperature. This was psychological warfare. Hale was showing them they were outmanned, outgunned, and utterly alone, showing them that resistance was futile. The riders stayed there for 2 hours, not moving, not speaking. Then, just before dawn, they turned and rode away. Nobody relaxed. If anything, the tension got worse because now they knew. Knew Hale had brought an army, knew the fight was coming soon, knew that when it came, it would be brutal and one-sided. "How long?" Dutch asked quietly, lowering his rifle. "Soon," Mateo said. "He's made his point. Next time he comes, it won't be to talk." They reinforced their positions, checked their ammunition again, and waited. The day crawled past with agonizing slowness. Clara tried to stay busy, cooking, organizing, anything to keep her hands occupied and her mind from running through all the ways this could go wrong. Evening came. Then full dark. The temperature dropped and frost formed on the windows they hadn't boarded up. Clara was in the kitchen making coffee when she heard the first gunshot. It came from the direction of the north pasture, a single crack followed by several more in rapid succession. Then shouting, the pounding of hooves, and suddenly the whole ranch was erupting into chaos. "They're burning the barn!" James screamed from somewhere outside. Clara ran to the window and saw flames already climbing the wooden structure, bright and hungry in the darkness. Dutch and James came running out, coughing from the smoke. Behind them, she could see riders circling, firing into the air, driving the horses into a panic. "Stay in the house," Silas ordered, but Clara was already moving, grabbing buckets, knowing that if the barn went up completely, the fire would spread to the other buildings. She made it 3 steps out the door before gunfire erupted from the darkness. Bullets slammed into the porch railing, the door frame, the ground at her feet. Clara dove back inside, her heart hammering. "They're trying to draw us out," Mateo yelled from his position by the window. "Don't take the bait." But the barn was burning. The horses were screaming, and Clara could see men moving in the darkness beyond the firelight, shadows with guns, circling like wolves. "We can't just let it burn." Thomas was already moving toward the door. "You go out there, you're dead." Silas grabbed the young man's arm, held him back. "That's what they want. They want us scattered, panicked, easy to pick off." He was right. Clara knew he was right. But watching the barn burn, hearing the animals in distress, every instinct in her body was screaming to do something. Then she saw him. Colonel Victor Hale himself, riding forward into the firelight, so confident in his superiority that he didn't even bother with cover. He sat his horse like a king surveying conquered territory, and when he spoke, his voice carried clear across the chaos. "Mercer, come out and we'll talk. You have my word no one gets hurt." "His word," Dutch spat. "That's worth about as much as spit in a windstorm." But Clara was already moving. Before anyone could stop her, before she could think better of it, she walked straight out the front door with her hands visible and empty. The shooting stopped. The riders went still. Even the fire seemed to quiet, though that was probably just her imagination. "Clara, what the hell are you doing?" Silas hissed from behind her. She ignored him, kept walking until she was 10 feet from Hale's horse, close enough to see his face clearly in the firelight. "You wanted to talk," she said. "So, talk." Hale looked down at her, and something like surprise flickered across his features. Then it was gone, replaced by that cold calculation. "Brave," he said. "Or stupid. Hard to tell which. Probably both." Clara's hands were shaking, but she kept them still through sheer force of will. "But I'm tired of this dance. You want the ranch. We won't sell. So either kill us or leave us alone, but stop burning barns and terrorizing people in the middle of the night like some kind of coward." The word landed like a slap. Hale's face went hard, and several of his men shifted in their saddles. Clara was dimly aware that she'd just insulted a dangerous man in front of his hired guns, but she was past caring. "Coward?" Hale's voice was soft, dangerous. "You think I'm a coward? I think you're a bully who's been getting his way for so long you've forgotten what real opposition looks like." Clara took a step forward. "You could have come here with lawyers, with legal claims and proper paperwork. But instead you came with guns and threats because that's all you know. That's all you've ever known. And you think your little telegraph messages are going to save you." Hale leaned forward in his saddle. "You think anyone cares about some photographs and accusations from a nobody rancher and his too-tall wife?" "I think you're scared," Clara said. "I think that's why you're here instead of waiting for the law to sort this out, because you know what we sent was real, and you know it's enough to hurt you. Maybe not destroy you, but hurt you. And men like you can't stand being hurt." Hale stared at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was the most terrible thing Clara had ever seen, empty and cold and utterly without mercy. "You're right," he said quietly. "I am scared. Scared I'll lose everything I've built. Scared I'll end up in prison or worse. And you know what scared men do, Mrs. Mercer?" Clara didn't answer. "They make sure the threats go away." Hale straightened in his saddle. "You had a chance to walk away, to take the money and start over somewhere else. But you chose this. You chose to fight a battle you cannot possibly win. So whatever happens next, remember that you brought it on yourself." He wheeled his horse around and rode back toward his men. Clara stood there in the firelight, watching him go, and felt something settle in her chest that might have been resignation or might have been resolve. Then Hale raised his hand and the world exploded. Gunfire erupted from every direction. Clara ran for the house as bullets tore through the air around her. She felt something hot slice across her upper arm, but didn't stop, just kept running until hands grabbed her and hauled her through the door. "What the hell were you thinking?" Silas was furious and terrified in equal measure, already pressing a cloth against the bleeding wound on her arm. "You could have been killed." "I had to try," Clara gasped. "Had to see if there was any way to end this without—" The window above them shattered. Glass rained down as more bullets punched through the walls. Outside, the barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the sky. And around it, Hale's men were advancing. "Positions!" Mateo's voice cut through the chaos. "Make every shot count!" They fought. Clara found herself at a window with Silas's revolver, firing at shadows and muzzle flashes, trying to make herself small behind the minimal cover. The noise was deafening. Gunfire, shouting, the roar of the burning barn. The smell of smoke and gunpowder filled the house. Someone screamed outside. One of Hale's men, hit by a shot from the bunkhouse. The riders pulled back slightly, regrouping. In the brief lull, Clara could hear her own ragged breathing, could feel the sting of the wound on her arm, could taste blood where she'd bitten her lip without noticing. "How many rounds left?" Silas called out. The answers came back grim. They were running low on ammunition, and the fight had barely started. Then Clara heard it. The sound she'd been listening for without quite realizing it. Horses. A lot of them. Coming fast from the south. "More riders!" Dutch yelled. "We're surrounded!" But these riders were different. They came in a tight formation, and at their head was a man wearing a silver star that caught the firelight. "Federal Marshal!" the man shouted. "Everyone lower your weapons!" The fighting stopped like someone had flipped a switch. Hale's men looked at each other, uncertain. The marshal and his deputies, Clara counted at least 8 of them, spread out across the ranch yard, hands on their guns but not drawn yet. The marshal himself rode straight to where Hale sat his horse, still silhouetted against the burning barn. "Colonel Victor Hale?" Hale's face had gone pale. "Marshal Garrett, this is unexpected." "I'm sure it is." Garrett's voice was flat, emotionless. "You're under arrest for cattle theft, brand fraud, and attempted murder. Your men can ride out now, or they can join you in irons. Their choice." For one terrible moment, Clara thought Hale was going to fight, thought he was going to order his men to shoot, thought this was all going to end in more blood and more death. Then Hale looked at Clara, still standing in the doorway with blood running down her arm and smoke stains on her face. Looked at her and saw something that finally made him realize he'd lost. He dismounted slowly, holding his hands out to his sides. "There's been a misunderstanding, Marshal. These people have been making false accusations. Save it for the judge." Garrett gestured to one of his deputies, who came forward with iron shackles. "You've got a lot to answer for, Colonel. A lot of very detailed evidence sitting on my desk in Denver. Evidence from sources all over this territory, all telling the same story." Hale's men were already dispersing, melting away into the darkness. Hired guns knew when to cut their losses. Within minutes, the only people left were the marshals, Hale in chains, and the people of the Mercer Ranch standing in their battered, bullet-riddled house, watching justice finally arrive. Clara's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the porch steps, dimly aware of Silas beside her, of Mateo's hand on her shoulder, of Dutch saying something she couldn't quite hear over the ringing in her ears. They'd done it. Somehow, impossibly, they'd survived long enough. Marshal Garrett approached the porch, tipping his hat to Clara. "Mrs. Mercer, I presume. You sent quite a lot of documentation to my office." "Had to make sure you'd pay attention," Clara managed. "Oh, we paid attention." Garrett looked around at the burning barn, the bullet holes, the chaos. "Looks like we almost didn't make it in time, though." "Almost only counts in horseshoes," Silas said, and Clara felt a laugh bubble up that might have been hysteria. They watched as the marshals loaded Hale into a wagon. The great Colonel Victor Hale, reduced to a prisoner being hauled away into the night. He didn't look back, didn't say anything, just sat there with his hands in chains and his empire crumbling around him. When the wagon disappeared over the rise, Clara finally let herself believe it was real. The barn burned through the night, collapsing in on itself with a groan of timber and a shower of sparks that rose toward the stars like angry fireflies. By morning, all that remained was a blackened skeleton and the acrid smell of charred wood that would linger for weeks. Clara stood at the kitchen window watching the sun rise over the wreckage, her wounded arm bandaged and throbbing with each heartbeat. Behind her, Silas was making coffee with his one good arm, moving slow and careful, like every motion hurt. The house was quiet except for the soft snoring from the front room, where Mateo and Dutch had finally collapsed after staying awake for 36 hours straight. "We need a new barn," Silas said, setting a cup of coffee beside Clara's elbow. "We need a lot of things." Clara picked up the cup, warming her hands against the tin. "New windows, new doors, repairs to the bunkhouse where the bullets went through." She paused. "Money to pay for all of it. Marshall said there'd be reward money, federal bounty on Hale for the cattle theft, plus restitution from his estate once it gets liquidated." Silas leaned against the counter beside her. "Won't happen overnight, but it'll happen." "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, we rebuild with what we have." He took a sip of his coffee, winced. "Might take a while, though." Clara looked at him, really looked. The bandages visible under his shirt, the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, the way he held himself like a man who'd been beaten but refused to stay down. She thought about the question he'd asked her before the fight, the promise she'd made about answering when they survived. They'd survived. Barely, messily, with scars they'd carry for the rest of their lives. But they'd survived. "Ask me," she said quietly. Silas blinked. "What?" "The question you wanted to ask, before everything went to hell." Clara set down her coffee and turned to face him properly. "Ask me now." Silas stared at her for a long moment. Then he set down his own cup and took her hands, careful of the bandage on her arm, gentle in a way that made Clara's throat tight. "Clara Whitmore," he said, and his voice was rough with something that might have been emotion. "Will you marry me? For real this time? Not just for convenience or protection, or because it made sense at the time, but because I want you beside me for whatever comes next." Clara had spent most of her life being told she wasn't wanted. Too tall, too plain, too sharp-tongued, too old. She'd been dismissed and overlooked and treated like something to be endured rather than chosen. But here was this man, broken and stubborn and honest, choosing her anyway. "Yes," she said, and felt something unlock in her chest that had been closed for years. "Yes, I'll marry you." Silas pulled her close, careful of both their injuries, and kissed her. It wasn't some grand romantic gesture. They both tasted like smoke and coffee and exhaustion, but it was real. Solid. A promise made in the wreckage of what they'd survived and the uncertainty of what came next. When they finally pulled apart, Dutch was standing in the doorway watching them with a knowing smirk. "About damn time," the old ranch hand said. "We all been taking bets on how long it'd take you two to figure it out." Clara felt her face heat. "You've been betting on us?" "Pete had money on Christmas. Thomas said New Year's. I said you'd be smart enough to do it before winter really set in." Dutch grinned. "Looks like I win." "You're all terrible," Clara said, but she was smiling. "We're terrible people who just survived a war," Dutch corrected. "That earns us the right to be a little terrible about other things, too." Marshal Garrett came back 3 days later with a federal investigator and a man from the Territorial Land Office. They spent 2 days going through what remained of Hale's ranch, documenting evidence, interviewing witnesses. Clara gave her testimony in the kitchen of the Mercer Ranch, walking them through everything: the ledgers, the photographs, the rebranded cattle, the night Hale's men had tried to kill them. The investigator, a thin man named Carson with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers, took notes in a precise hand. When Clara finished, he set down his pencil and looked at her with something like respect. "Mrs. Mercer, what you've done here, building this case, gathering this evidence, standing up to one of the most powerful men in Colorado Territory, that takes courage most people don't have." "Took desperation more than courage," Clara said honestly. "We didn't have a choice." "Everyone has a choice," Carson replied. "Most people choose to look the other way, choose to accept that this is just how things are. You chose differently." He closed his notebook. "Colonel Hale is going to spend the rest of his life in federal prison. His assets are being seized, his properties auctioned. Every crooked deal he made is being exposed. That doesn't happen often, Mrs. Mercer. That's not how the world usually works." "Maybe it should be," Clara said quietly. Carson smiled, a small, tired smile. "Maybe it should." The trial happened in Denver 6 weeks later. Clara and Silas made the journey by train, leaving Mateo in charge of the ranch. The territorial capital was bigger than anything Clara had seen since leaving Pittsburgh. Buildings that stretched 3 and 4 stories high. Streets full of wagons and people, noise and chaos that made her head spin after months of ranch silence. The courthouse was an imposing stone structure with columns that looked like they'd been borrowed from ancient Rome. Clara climbed the steps wearing her best dress, which Catherine Walsh had helped her buy from the general store, refusing to accept payment, and felt like she was walking into battle one more time. The courtroom was packed. Apparently the downfall of Colonel Victor Hale was big news, and everyone wanted to see it happen in person. Clara spotted Catherine in the gallery, sitting beside Pete, who'd insisted on coming along for moral support. Mateo had sent a letter that arrived the day before the trial started, writing in careful Spanish that he was proud of what she'd done and to make sure the bastard paid for all of it. Hale himself looked diminished in his prisoner's clothes, sitting between 2 guards at the defendant's table. He didn't look at Clara when she walked in, didn't acknowledge her existence at all. She wondered if that was pride or shame or just the final defense of a man who'd lost everything and couldn't bear to face the person who'd brought him down. The prosecution called Clara to testify on the second day. She walked to the witness stand on legs that felt steadier than she'd expected, placed her hand on the Bible for the oath, and sat down facing a room full of strangers who were about to hear her story. The prosecutor was a competent man named Harrison, who walked Clara through the evidence methodically. The ledgers, the photographs, the discrepancies in shipping records, the rebranded cattle, the threats and the violence and the night the barn burned. "Mrs. Mercer," Harrison said at one point, "why did you risk your life to pursue this case? You could have simply left, moved to a different territory, started over somewhere safer." Clara thought about how to answer that. Thought about all the reasons, the anger, the pride, the stubborn refusal to let cruel men win just because they'd always won before. But in the end, she went with the simplest truth. Because someone had to, she said. Because if everyone just accepted that this is how things work, then nothing would ever change. And I was tired of being part of a world where men like Colonel Hale could destroy lives without consequence. The defense attorney tried to shake her testimony on cross-examination, suggesting she'd fabricated evidence, that she was motivated by greed or revenge or simple vindictiveness. Clara answered each question calmly, precisely, never losing her temper even when the attorney's implications became insulting. Finally, the defense attorney asked, "Mrs. Mercer, isn't it true that you came to Colorado as a mail-order bride because you had failed at everything else? That you were desperate and grasping at any opportunity?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes. I came here desperate. I came here with nothing and no prospects and no reason to think things would get better. But desperation doesn't make someone a liar, counselor. Sometimes it just makes them brave enough to tell the truth when no one else will." The courtroom went quiet. Even the defense attorney seemed at a loss for words. He dismissed Clara shortly after, and she walked back to her seat beside Silas, feeling like she'd just won something important, even though the trial wasn't over yet. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they came back, the foreman stood and read the verdict in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. Guilty on all counts. Clara felt Silas's hand find hers, squeezed tight. Around them, the courtroom erupted in conversation, some people cheering, others shocked that it had actually happened. On the defendant's bench, Hale sat perfectly still, his face blank, as the judge sentenced him to 20 years in federal prison, followed by forfeiture of all assets and properties. It was done. Really, truly done. They stayed in Denver for another week while the Territorial Land Office sorted through the paperwork for Hale's seized properties. The ranch hands who'd worked for Hale were being relocated or released, depending on their level of involvement in his crimes. The land itself was being divided. Some would be auctioned, some returned to the families Hale had stolen it from, and the Mercer Ranch, which had been slowly failing under the weight of Hale's theft and intimidation, was going to receive compensation. Not enough to make them rich, but enough to rebuild. Enough to expand. Enough to stop scraping by on hope and borrowed time. Clara stood in the land office reviewing the settlement documents when the clerk mentioned something that made her stop. "There's also the matter of the reward money," the clerk said, consulting his papers. "Federal bounty for information leading to prosecution of interstate cattle theft. That's $500. Plus the territorial reward for exposing corruption. Another $300. He looked up. "That's $800, Mrs. Mercer. Quite a substantial sum." Clara stared at the number written on the paper. $800. She'd never had that much money in her entire life. With that kind of money, they could rebuild the barn properly, buy breeding stock, hire more help, make the ranch into something that could actually support a family instead of just barely surviving. "There's one more thing," the clerk said, pulling out another document. "Several of the properties Colonel Hale acquired through intimidation and fraud are being returned to their original owners. But there's one parcel, about 200 acres on the northern boundary, that was purchased from a man who's since died with no heirs. That land reverts to the territory unless someone files a claim." He pushed the paper across the desk. "Given your role in the case, and given that the land borders your current property, you'd have priority if you wanted to file." Clara looked at the map showing the parcel. It was good land, water access, decent grazing, strategically valuable. With that addition, the Mercer Ranch would nearly double in size. "What's the cost?" she asked. "Standard rate, $1 an acre, $200 total." Clara did the math in her head. Take the reward money, use $200 for the land, and they'd still have $600 left for rebuilding and improvements. It was a good deal. More than good. "I'll file the claim," she said. When she told Silas that evening over dinner in the hotel restaurant, he set down his fork and stared at her. "You used the reward money to buy more land?" "Our reward money," Clara corrected. "And yes, that land gives us water rights and controls the northern approach. With proper management, we could run another 100 head of cattle, maybe more." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he started laughing, deep, genuine laughter that turned heads at nearby tables. "What's funny?" Clara demanded. "You are." Silas reached across the table and took her hand. "Most people get a windfall like that. They'd spend it on something easy, something comfortable. But not you. You immediately turn it into more work, more responsibility, more land to manage. Is that a problem? It's perfect, Silas said, still smiling. It's exactly who you are. And it's one of the reasons I love you. The words hung in the air between them. Clara felt her breath catch. They'd talked around it, implied it, shown it through actions. But this was the first time either of them had said it out loud. You love me? Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Yeah, Silas said simply. I do. Probably have for a while now, but I'm slow at figuring these things out. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Not sad tears, but the kind that came when something tight and painful finally loosened. I love you too, she said. Even though you're stubborn and terrible at bookkeeping and you almost got yourself killed being heroic. That last one was mostly you being heroic, Silas pointed out. We're both terrible at staying safe, Clara amended. Good thing we found each other. They were married 2 weeks after returning to the ranch, on a cold December morning with snow threatening in the slate-gray sky. The ceremony took place in the house. There wasn't a church in Cedar Bend yet, and even if there had been, Clara preferred doing it here, surrounded by the walls they'd defended and the people who'd become family. Mateo stood up as witness, wearing his best shirt and looking uncomfortable in it. Catherine came from town with flowers she'd somehow coaxed from her winter greenhouse. Pete, Dutch, James, and Thomas cleaned up and shaved and tried to pretend they weren't getting emotional about the whole thing. The circuit judge who'd agreed to perform the ceremony was a practical man who kept things short. Clara wore the dress Catherine had helped her buy, simple blue wool that actually fit properly, and Silas wore a suit he'd borrowed from the undertaker in town. They stood in the front room with its patched bullet holes and mismatched furniture, holding hands, while the judge recited the words that would make them legally, officially, permanently joined. Do you, Silas Mercer, take Clara Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. And do you, Clara Whitmore, take Silas Mercer to be your lawfully wedded husband? Clara looked at the man beside her, scarred and healing, strong and stubborn, honest in ways that still surprised her. Thought about the journey that had brought them here, all the fear and pain and desperate fighting. Thought about the life they were building together in this harsh, beautiful place. I do, she said. The kiss was brief, appropriate for the audience, but Clara felt it down to her bones anyway. When they pulled apart, everyone was grinning. Even stoic Mateo had something that might have been a smile lurking at the corners of his mouth. Well, the judge said, signing the marriage certificate with a flourish, you're officially the most stubborn married couple in Colorado territory. Congratulations. The celebration afterward was modest. Whiskey for the men, wine Catherine had brought for Clara, a meal cobbled together from what they had on hand. But it felt right. Felt like what they'd earned through blood and determination and refusing to accept that powerful men should always win. Late that night, after everyone else had gone to bed or back to the bunkhouse, Clara and Silas sat on the porch wrapped in blankets and watching the stars. The temperature had dropped below freezing, but the sky was clear, and the stars were so bright they looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. What are you thinking about? Silas asked. Clara considered the question. I'm thinking about the woman who stepped off that train back in October. How scared she was. How certain she was that this was going to be just another failure in a long line of failures. And now? Now I'm thinking that sometimes the worst decisions turn out to be the best ones. Clara leaned into his warmth. Coming here was desperate. Marrying a stranger was probably stupid, but it worked out anyway. Not without a lot of blood and near-death experiences, Silas pointed out. Well, nothing worth having comes easy. Clara pulled the blanket tighter. My father used to say that. He'd say it when the crop failed, when the animals got sick, when everything seemed impossible. Said the things you had to fight for were the things you'd actually value. Your father sounds like he was a smart man. He was a stubborn man who didn't know when to quit, Clara corrected, but I guess I got that from him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. The ranch was quiet now. No gunfire, no threats, just the ordinary sounds of a working property at rest. What do we do now? Silas asked eventually. After everything that's happened, what comes next? Clara thought about it. Thought about the barn they needed to rebuild, the land they needed to manage, the cattle they needed to acquire and breed. Thought about the seasons that would come, Spring calving, summer roundups, fall sales, winter survival. Thought about the years stretching ahead, full of work and hardship, and the small victories that made it worthwhile. We build something that lasts, she said. We make this ranch successful. We treat our people fairly. We prove that you can win without being cruel, that you can be strong without being a bully. She paused. And maybe, eventually, we build something bigger than just us. A legacy. Something that shows other people they don't have to accept the world as it is. That's ambitious, Silas said, but he was smiling. I'm an ambitious woman. You should know that by now. Trust me, Silas said, pulling her closer. I know. The rebuilding took all of winter and most of spring. They started with the barn, a new structure, bigger than the old one, with proper ventilation and space for twice as many animals. Dutch and James did most of the heavy work while Silas supervised and Clara managed the finances with an iron grip that would have made a banker weep. The northern land parcel was surveyed and added to their property. They hired 2 more hands, both young men from town who'd lost their positions when Hale's operation collapsed and needed honest work. Clara interviewed them personally, making it clear what kind of ranch this was and what she expected from anyone working here. We pay fair wages, she told them. We don't cheat on the books or treat our people like they're disposable. But we also don't tolerate laziness or dishonesty. You do good work. You'll have a place here as long as you want it. You cause problems. You're gone. That clear? Both men nodded, and both turned out to be solid workers who integrated well with the existing crew. Spring brought calving season, and with it the kind of exhausting work that made even Mateo complain about his aching back. Clara found herself spending long nights in the barn, helping difficult births, treating sick calves, doing all the unglamorous work that kept a ranch running. Her hands got rougher, her face got more weathered, and she stopped caring about either. By summer, the Mercer Ranch was running smoothly for the first time in years. The cattle were healthy, the books were in order, and they'd even started turning a modest profit. Word spread that Silas and Clara Mercer ran an honest operation, and other ranchers started coming to them for advice, for help settling disputes, for a fair assessment of livestock value. Clara became something of a legend in Cedar Bend, the woman who'd brought down Colonel Hale, who'd built a legal case that sent a powerful man to prison, who'd stood up to hired guns and survived. People treated her with respect now, though Clara noted wryly that the same women who'd whispered about her on the train platform now invited her to their social gatherings and asked her opinion on everything from cattle breeding to territorial politics. They're scared of you, Catherine said one afternoon when Clara mentioned it. They were sitting in the kitchen of the ranch house, drinking tea and reviewing the books for the general store. Catherine had been promoted to manager after Hale's cronies had been forced out, and she sometimes asked Clara's advice on financial matters. Why would they be scared of me? Clara asked. Because you're proof that women can be more than decorative. Catherine set down her teacup. You run this ranch as much as Silas does. Everyone knows it. You handle the books, manage the hiring, make half the major decisions. And you did all that while also taking down the most powerful man in the territory. She smiled. That scares people who've been told their whole lives that women should be quiet and grateful for whatever scraps men throw them. Clara thought about that, about all the women she'd met in her life who'd been taught to make themselves small, to accept limitations, to never reach for more than what was offered. She'd been one of them once, had believed the world when it told her she was too much of the wrong things and not enough of the right ones. Good, she said finally. Let them be scared. Maybe some of them will get brave enough to want more for themselves too. The first anniversary of Clara's arrival at the ranch came and went quietly. They marked it with a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just the usual crew gathered around the kitchen table sharing food and stories. But afterward, Silas pulled Clara aside and handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. What's this? Clara asked. Open it. Inside was a photograph in a simple wooden frame. It showed the ranch house, the new barn, the corrals and outbuildings. But more importantly, it showed the people. All of them together in front of the main house. Mateo standing straight and proud despite his age. Dutch and the boys grinning like idiots. Catherine, who'd ridden out for the occasion, looking fierce and beautiful in the sunlight. And in the center, Silas and Clara, his arm around her shoulders and her hand on his chest, both of them looking at the camera like they were daring it to capture something they couldn't name. When did you? Clara's voice caught. Last month. Hired a photographer from Denver to come out. Silas pointed to the inscription at the bottom of the frame. Read it. Clara tilted the frame toward the light and read the words carved into the wood. The Mercer Ranch, 1885, built on courage and stubbornness. She laughed, and it turned into something that might have been a sob. That's terrible. That's accurate, Silas corrected. And it's true. This place wouldn't exist without both. Clara set the photograph on the mantel, right where everyone who entered the house would see it. It looked right there, proof that they'd survived, that they'd built something real, that all the fighting and fear had been worth it. Years passed. The ranch prospered. They expanded their herd, improved their breeding stock, developed a reputation for quality cattle that sold at premium prices in Denver and Kansas City. Clara and Silas became fixtures at Territorial Cattle Association meetings, their opinions sought and respected. Pete's leg healed well enough that he could ride again, though he walked with a permanent limp. He stayed on at the ranch, eventually becoming Mateo's second in command. Dutch got older and crankier but refused to retire, claiming he'd die in the saddle and they could bury him wherever he fell. James and Thomas bought a small property of their own 2 counties over, using money they'd saved from fair wages and honest work. Catherine married a newspaper editor from Denver and opened a bookshop in Cedar Bend that became the intellectual center of the growing town. She and Clara remained close friends, meeting regularly to discuss books and politics and the slow, frustrating work of changing people's minds about what women could accomplish. Mateo developed arthritis in his hands, but kept working until the day he died in his sleep at age 73, peacefully in his bunk at the ranch that had become his home. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the northern pasture, and Clara cried for the first time since the trial, not just for Mateo, but for everything they'd all survived together. New people came to the territory, young couples looking for opportunity, families fleeing poverty or violence or the limitations of more settled places. The Mercer Ranch hired several of them, and Clara made sure they understood the rules. Honest work for honest pay, no tolerance for cruelty or cheating. Everyone gets treated with basic human dignity, regardless of who they are or where they came from. Some people thought she was too soft. Others thought she was too hard. Clara stopped caring about either opinion around year 3 and never looked back. She and Silas never had children. Whether by choice or chance, Clara never discussed and nobody dared ask. But the ranch became their legacy anyway, proof that you could build something lasting through integrity rather than intimidation. Other ranchers started adopting their practices. The territory passed laws against brand fraud, strengthened protections for property rights, created oversight for cattle sales that made Hale's kind of operation much harder to run. It wasn't a revolution. The world didn't transform overnight. Powerful men still got away with terrible things, and justice still arrived too late for too many people. But it was progress. Small, incremental, hard-won progress that Clara and Silas and everyone who'd fought beside them could point to and say, "We did that. We made things a little bit better." On a cold November evening, 20 years after Clara first stepped off that train, she sat on the porch of the ranch house and watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Her hair was fully gray now, her hands were gnarled with arthritis, and her back ached on cold days from old injuries that had never quite healed right. Silas joined her, moving slower than he used to, but still solid, still steady. They sat in their usual chairs, worn comfortable over 2 decades of use, and watched the light fade. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Silas asked. "If you'd stayed in Pennsylvania? If I'd sent you back that first day?" Clara considered it honestly. "Sometimes. Usually when my back hurts or winter's being particularly brutal," she smiled. "But then I look at what we built and I can't imagine having done anything else. Even with everything that happened, the fighting, the near-death experiences, all of it, especially because of all that." Clara reached over and took his hand. "The easy life wouldn't have been worth living, not for me. I needed something to fight for, something that mattered. This ranch, these people, this life, it was worth every scar." Silas squeezed her hand. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you saved my life. Not just that day in the gunfight, but before that, when you showed up and forced me to start living again instead of just existing." He looked at her, his eyes still sharp despite the years. "I was dying slowly when you arrived, Clara, letting this place fall apart, letting Hale steal from me, too beaten down to care. You changed that. You changed everything." "We changed it together," Clara corrected. You could have sent me away. Could have given up when things got hard. But you didn't. You fought beside me, trusted me when other men wouldn't have. That mattered more than you know." They sat in silence as full dark settled over the ranch. Lights appeared in the bunkhouse windows where the current crew was probably playing cards or arguing about baseball. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and was answered by another. The sounds of their world, comfortable and familiar. "Do you have any regrets?" Silas asked quietly. Clara thought about it. About all the paths not taken, the easier choices she could have made, the safer life she could have lived. Thought about Edward in Pennsylvania and the woman she'd been before this place had tempered her into something harder and stronger. "I regret the people who got hurt," she said finally. Tom Walsh, Catherine's brother. The ranch hands who lost work when Hale's operation collapsed. All the years people suffered because no one stood up to him sooner. She paused. "But I don't regret fighting. Don't regret any of the choices that brought me here. This was the life I was supposed to live, even if I didn't know it when I started." "Think we made a difference?" Clara gestured toward the ranch spread out before them in the darkness. "We're still here. The ranch is thriving. The people who work for us are treated fairly and paid honestly. Other ranchers followed our example. The territory changed its laws." She squeezed his hand. "That's not nothing, Silas. That's everything." They sat together until the cold drove them inside. Two people who'd found each other by accident and built something permanent through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The ranch would outlast them. Already was outlasting them, really, with younger hands taking over more of the work each year. But what they'd built wasn't just buildings and cattle and land. It was proof that courage mattered, that standing up to bullies could actually work, that ordinary people willing to fight for what was right could change things, even when the odds seemed impossible. It was proof that a woman nobody wanted could become the woman everyone needed, and that sometimes the life you didn't plan for turned out to be exactly the life you were meant to live. Clara and Silas Mercer lived another decade after that November evening, watching the territory transform from wild frontier to established state, watching Cedar Bend grow from a dusty rail stop to a proper town with schools and churches, and a newspaper that Catherine's husband ran with crusading fervor. When Clara finally died at 68, peacefully in her sleep after a long day's work, half the territory came to her funeral. Ranchers and homesteaders, business people and politicians, men and women whose lives she'd touched in ways large and small. They came to pay respects to the woman who'd proven that strength didn't require cruelty, that justice was worth fighting for even when it seemed impossible, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in any room was the one everyone had underestimated. They buried her on the same hillside where Mateo rested, overlooking the land she'd fought to protect, and the legacy she'd built through blood and determination and absolute refusal to accept that things had to stay the way they'd always been. Silas joined her 3 years later, and they were remembered together, not as perfect people, but as stubborn ones who'd faced impossible odds and won anyway. The ranch continued on, passed to loyal hands who understood what it represented and what it demanded. And in Cedar Bend, in the comfortable houses and bustling businesses that had grown up where there'd once been only dust and danger, people still told the story of Clara Whitmore Mercer, the mail-order bride nobody wanted who became the woman who changed everything, the tall, plain widow in patched gloves who'd walked off a train expecting rejection and instead found a fight worth having and a life worth living. They told her story to their daughters and granddaughters, a reminder that the world didn't have to stay the way cruel men wanted it, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they were brave enough to try, that sometimes the only thing standing between tyranny and justice was someone willing to stand up and say, "No more." It wasn't a fairy tale. Clara and Silas had never lived a fairy tale. It was messier than that, harder than that, more real than that. But it was true in the ways that mattered, true in courage and consequence, in love earned rather than given, in change fought for rather than hoped for. And in the end, maybe that was the only kind of story worth telling anyway.